I do not see our DDOT people logged in. No, he's MDOT. The people are Charlie Wilson and Christine Mayor. Yeah.
Lynn, let me know when you're ready for me to start.
Okay, Pam, we will. Thanks.
I don't know if I have anything but an email address. Do you have the contact information for the DDOT people?
Ms. Sebesky?
Hi, Conti. Let me know when we're ready to start.
In about just in
We're
about
waiting
60
for a
seconds,
speaker to join.
we're just waiting for one more speaker, and it's 10:29. Just 60 more seconds.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you.
DDOT. Yeah. No, virtual. No. They may be doing it from some joint settings they're using for them. And the reason it was two is because they were juggling another meeting. Yes. Yeah, I'd wait 1 or 2 more minutes and then do that, I think would be what I would recommend, because Janie is calling them to double check what the status is.
Ms. Sebesky?
Yes, Conti. Are we ready?
Yeah, we'll get started. Just in case, we might want to switch the agenda order a little bit, and we will start with Maryland, Virginia, and then go to the District of Columbia.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Pam Sebesky. I'm the chair of the Transportation Planning Board, and I welcome you to the TPB's November 16th special work session on transportation safety. Welcome to all those of you here in person and those of you joining virtually. I trust the audio and video connections are working well for those of you participating virtually. As always, please call, email, or text staff if you are experiencing any technical difficulties. Just let everyone know, unfortunately, yesterday I became ill and I now have COVID. So as the best interest of everyone and for the safety of everyone, I decided to run the meeting with the help of Conti and Lynn to run this meeting remotely. I sincerely apologize that I'm not there with you in person for our last in-person meeting of the year, but in the best interest of everyone, this was the best way to do it. Just as is done for the regular TPB meetings, we are live streaming the audio and video of this work session on TPB's YouTube channel. I will briefly review the process for the hybrid work session. Members in the room, please use the microphone when you speak, and please be close to the microphone so that those online and those watching the broadcast can hear you. Those participating online, a friendly reminder to mute your microphones always, and importantly, to unmute your mic and state your name and jurisdiction when you do speak. Members who are participating virtually, please know that staff is monitoring the chat. So feel free to post your comments or questions in the chat and staff will get it to me. You can also use the raised hand icon if you wish to be recognized. As we begin the work session this morning, let us recall that the TPB has been focused on efforts to improve roadway safety outcomes in the region for a number of years now. We commissioned a regional safety study in 2019 to better understand the factors behind the unacceptable numbers of fatalities and serious injuries occurring on the region's roadways. In 2020, we adopted the TPB Regional Roadway Safety Policy spelled out in Resolution R3-2021, identifying an extensive list of strategies for member agencies to consider for implementation to improve safety outcomes. Also in 2020, we created the Regional Roadway Safety Program, providing consultant services to member jurisdictions or agencies to assist with planning or preliminary engineering projects that address roadway safety issues. We are glad to report that we have already had 2 rounds of projects accomplished under this program, with a 3rd roadway underway. And most recently, we were briefed by the U.S. Department of Transportation on their emerging safe system approach for making a difference in roadway safety. Later today on at the regular TPB meeting agenda, we will be considering the next round of annual draft transit and roadway safety targets under the federal performance planning and programming processes slated for approval at the December TPB meeting. TPB has continued to focus on making progress on these targets. Starting back in 2019, TPB has requested periodic briefings from our member departments of transportation on their efforts to improve safety. Previous briefings and reports from our state departments of transportation have fostered important TPB discussions. In continuation of this series of reports, today we are pleased to be joined by representatives from the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia's Departments of Transportation for today's special work session to hear updates on their activities and to address safety. Each Department of Transportation will have about 10 minutes for their prepared remarks, followed by a moment of clarifying questions. After all speakers have had their turn, we will then have a joint question and answer session for TPB members to ask of any of or all panelists. Finally, we do plan to conclude promptly no later than 11:45 to allow setup and transition to the main TPB meeting at 12 noon. I would now like to introduce Andrew Meese, Systems Performance Planning Program Director on the TPB staff to introduce today's panelists and guide us through the presentations. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're there so you can know who's participating.
Thank you, Chair Sebeski, and good morning to members of the board and other participants. Yes, I'm Andrew Meese. I'm just going to quickly get to our panelists today, and I will introduce them as we come along, starting with the District of Columbia representatives who are joining us online, represented today by Charlie Wilson, Vision Zero Analyst, and Christine Mayor, Transportation Specialist for the District Department of Transportation. And so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Charlie and Christine for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I'm Christine Mayer with the District Department of Transportation on the Vision Zero Division. We are here to present on the 2022 update that we just released last month as part of Mayor Bowser's Vision Zero initiative. We also have a new website that debuted along with this update. So there's more details on that website as well. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. So we'll talk about our goals and progress, the focus strategy, what's new for Vision Zero coming out of this report, and then acting on this plan. Next slide, please. So goals and progress. So over the past 20 years, we have seen significant decline in traffic fatalities, but we are falling short of where we wanted to be as originally scheduled or planned in 2015. We wanted to be at 0 deaths by 2024. Obviously, we're falling short of that. And the pandemic hasn't really helped in that matter. We've seen fatalities rise over the past 2.5, 3 years. But understanding where we are in the context of that in the United States, it's important for us to look to sister cities that are also Vision Zero action oriented. And so we've been looking at Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and Philadelphia to learn from our peer cities what we can do to improve conditions on our roadways. Next slide, please. So when we were looking at the data to redo our high injury network and common crash patterns and things, we saw a few contributing factors that stood out. So our transportation systems and policies, vehicle miles traveled as a measurement or a correlation to crashes, commute mode share, how many people are driving in versus walking, biking, or taking transit, our street network density and our signal density, street types, and then the design of those. Land use and zoning has a big impact on how streets operate and the safety of those streets. So parcel size, block size, land uses, things like that. Demographic data as well. We've seen from national research that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are disproportionately affected by injury and fatality crashes versus other communities. In that those in poverty, facing poverty and low income, as well as unhoused populations, are also at a higher rate of exposure and therefore more frequently involved in severe and fatal crashes. Next slide, please. So like I said, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw fatalities rise. On the whole, traffic volumes went down significantly. With that, injuries decreased sharply. Pedestrian and cyclist reported injuries also decreasing. However, when a crash occurred, it tended to be more severe. So fatalities increased from 27 people in 2019 to 37 in 2020, and then 40 last year. So over 40% of those fatalities were hit and run, and then drivers striking fixed objects. Go forward, please. So our new strategy, centering equity is core to our work. Like I said earlier, the research has shown that focus on BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities is really important for traffic safety, focusing on low income areas and populations experiencing poverty or unhoused populations. So in the report, we have this map that overlays the non-white population density versus our fatalities, and then we've broken it out ward by ward, injuries and fatalities as well. Go forward, please. So we're embracing a safe systems approach that sort of came from USDOT and then originally from sort of New Zealand, Australia area of the globe. And so we've got our 5 focus areas very similar to USDOT: safe streets, safe speeds, safe people, safe vehicles, and post-crash care. Next slide, please. We've also established system-wide indicators that are linked to those key points in research that we saw. So looking at setting those kind of system-wide indicators to see how we're doing, and then those specific to each element of the safe system. Next slide, please. So safe streets, there's a few things I wanted to call out here. I won't go through all of them in the interest of time, but we're taking 3 major actions, which is making operating at safe speeds intuitive, reducing exposure to crash risks, excuse me, reducing conflicts between street users. And then because of vulnerability, we're making the safety of people walking, wheeling, or using mobility assistive devices as our top priority, followed by those biking and scooting.
Christine, did we lose you? We can't hear you.
Sorry, Christine went on mute to cough, and then I was on mute trying to get off. This is Charlie. Thanks, everyone. Yes, Christine was sharing. There's several underlying factors for the that we're evaluating when we're looking for safe streets, and we're evaluating for our high injury network. You can see the list here. I think the map is generally, it gives you an idea of the sort of the scope of a high injury network. I think a high injury network is a key component of any Vision Zero commitment. Most cities have them, and our regional partners who are committing to Vision Zero, as far as I understand, have them as well. What you're seeing in the high injury network map here is tiers, and you're also seeing the ones we had from 2015 when we originally took on Vision Zero. Next slide, please. A key element of our commitment is also safe speeds. In the last couple of years, DC lowered its default speed limit to 20 miles an hour. What that means is that if you don't see a sign, the speed limit is 20 miles an hour. That doesn't mean that every street is 20 miles an hour, but that default is important and valuable, and it's also accompanied by the idea that we're taking a look at speeds across the board. And when you look at some of our highest traffic roadways, our highest volume roadways, including that high injury network, we're pretty constantly looking at the speed limits on those roadways and lowering them. When we do lower speed limits, it's not just an aspirational change. It's based on prevailing speeds. It's based on roadway configurations, and it's based on, of course, safety. I think while obviously roadways need to be in some ways self-enforcing to really see lowering speeds, it is also true that simply lowering the speed limit can have a meaningful effect on speeds, on the prevailing speeds, because if you think about it, the typical driver does actually respond to the speed limit. And then those folks who ignore the speed limit still have to drive on the same roadway with those folks who have acknowledged the speed limit, if that makes sense. The reason safe speeds are so fundamental to a safe systems approach, of course, is that as you can see from the graph, there's a pretty sharp upward line on the relationship between speeds and injuries and possibility of fatality, right? And so what this graph does really elegantly is sort of, and frankly, it's a little bit scary, right? Is that you can see these big differences between sorry, the numbers are quite tiny, but if you go from 30 to 35, you're talking, or from 20 to 25, you see these sharp increases. And so these differences in speeds really do make a big difference, right? Next slide, please. Some of the commitments we've made, I mentioned self-enforcing streets. If that's not intuitive, the idea is that the design speed matches the posted speed. The idea there, I think you can think of sort of an example where it might be off base, like a country road that says, 30 miles an hour, but doesn't feel that way. The idea here would be, if we're lowering the speed limit, we're also thinking about narrowing the roadway in terms of the number of vehicle lanes, or otherwise narrowing the roadway at intersections, eliminating things like slip lanes that make turns faster, things like that. Another humongous part of our safe speeds commitment is the automated street, what we call street safe, or just referred to as automated traffic enforcement. The second bullet there, ATE, automated traffic enforcement. Folks are obviously, I'm assuming, familiar. DC has one of the most robust networks of automated traffic enforcement and speed cameras in the US. I think it's not an overstatement to say that the countries and jurisdictions that have seen the most generational success with Vision Zero are places that have committed, pretty strongly to automated traffic enforcement. And the idea there is that, you're never going to be able to enforce in person at the level that you do with cameras. I do want to step back though and note that typically speaking, even cameras that are high, giving a lot of citations, it's typically fewer than 1% of drivers. And so what you're doing is by enforcing it with that 1% of folks, you're really zeroing in on the folks who are creating a lot of the safety issues. Automated traffic enforcement has other advantages in being equitable in its administration, right? Like if you speed, you're going to get the ticket. There are lots of important questions to be asked about, the distribution of those cameras. I would also pause here to say that, automated speed enforcement is not something that DDOT uses in a vacuum, right? We're not just going to have a street that's designed for unsafe speeds and then put in cameras and call it done. We're going to, we're going to put forth the effort to combine that with other designs that enforce slower speeds as well. I mentioned the lower context sensitive speed limits as part of our dropping the speed limit to 20. We're also throughout the city lowering speed limits when appropriate. We do, of course, also do in-person enforcement of those things. You can also see the performance indicators within safe speeds. Next slide, please.
Toward me, Charlie and Christine,
Yes.
Could you wrap up in about 2 minutes because we are getting behind schedule here?
Okay, great. Christine, do you want to step back? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So Safe People, we can move forward on that one. So this one is focused on education and enforcement as well as legislative rules. So how our traffic safety rules are written and codified in law. So we've got action items related to that. If you go forward one. And then safe vehicles for the district, it's if you can go for the next slide. Looking at our citywide fleet, private vehicle safety, and then safety critical enforcement as our target areas for that. And then finally, if you want to go forward one more, post-crash care, focus on the survivability of crashes while creating a safe work environment for first responders. Next slide. And then for that, looking at our response times, traffic incident management standards, emergency medical services, making sure they're effective and meeting the needs of those involved in crashes. Post-critical crash interventions, that's where DDOT and MPD go to critical crash sites and evaluate safety, not only the cause of that crash, but any other potential risks that are at that location and make safety improvements. And then crash data collection, quality assurance, and quality control. So looking at our data records, seeing where there's missing information, and resolving those issues as quickly and as best as we can. Next slide, please. And then this is just a wrap up. So acting on the plan every day, every decision that we make, we're committing that all of those will reflect our goal of zero. And then as a government, we share a large part of the responsibility to do everything that we can in our power to prevent deaths and serious injuries. So with that, yeah, happy to take questions at that time.
Thank you, Christine and Charlie. I do not see any hands raised, and perhaps we should just move on to the next speaker. Recalling that we will have a question and answer session for all speakers after all the speakers have gone. But I do see one question, Mayor Rochelle. We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Question?
Sorry. You may have mentioned this and I just simply did not catch it, but when you address the education component, does this also include pedestrian education, for example, crossing the street at the appropriate location so pedestrians are able to take some personal responsibility for their own safety?
For in the focus of Vision Zero, we're focused on the modes that have the most excuse me, capacity to create harm. And for that, it's our larger vehicles. It's sort of a scale of responsibility. The larger vehicles, commercial vehicles, are at the top. We need those folks to be trained the best. And then on down to our pedestrians at the very bottom, and those walking and wheeling. So it is a spectrum of responsibility that we see, and we're tailoring the education appropriately to that.
So there will be pedestrian education.
We do that as part of the regional Street Smart,
Okay.
but that is not the focus of that. The focus is making sure that drivers, who are the ones most involved in those fatal crashes, are taking the responsibility that, yeah, that's appropriate.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, we do have a question in the room here.
Thank you. I was just really interested in your lowering of the speed limits, specifically below 25, because in Tacoma Park we're looking at doing that and struggling a little bit with what criteria or process we might follow for identifying best where to do that, since there could be many streets, particularly smaller side streets, where that might be appropriate. And it's somewhat difficult to tell how to do that. So I'm just curious if there's any sort of set of criteria that could potentially be shared with our planning staff that they could use as an example of maybe how to do that.
Well, I can start by saying we'd be happy to connect with you and have a longer conversation. This is Charlie from DDOT. But also for us, it was a relatively straightforward calculation, actually, because we use the roadway classification system. So the local roadways were 20, are now 20, and then I guess it actually worked out in another way, which is typically if it's a local roadway, meaning local classification under FHWA, it often didn't have a speed limit sign. So then by defaulting down to 20, the other ones, like the wider avenues, are going to have a speed limit, and so those remained until we made another determination based on US limits too. But yeah, but we're happy to follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the record, that was Casey Kostick, City of Tacoma Park, with that question. We really like to move on to our next speakers to ensure that they have sufficient time that we can return to questions later at the question and answer session. So Maryland is next, and they have several speakers. So I think Myra Wyman is going to be first. She's Deputy Director of the Maryland Highway Safety Office. And then I will leave it to you folks to guide us through who of your several speakers will be speaking during this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Myra Wayman, and I am the Deputy Director for the Maryland Highway Safety Office. We do operate under the Motor Vehicle Administration, which of course falls under the umbrella of the Maryland Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. We operate on an objective of reducing fatalities and serious injuries on all of our Maryland roads, and we do that with a strong strategy of building partnerships throughout the entire state so that we can strengthen all of the efforts that can improve safety on our roads. Next slide. Some of you may have seen this graphic representation before. Maryland uses this graphic of a wheel to explain our comprehensive approach to traffic safety. And this wheel has gone over some changes over the past year, actually over the past couple of years, but we continue to rely on the 4 principles that you'll see in the corners of this graphic. We rely on engineering, education, enforcement, and of course our EMS services. We categorize our key emphasis areas in gold with additional focus groups and vulnerable road users denoted in red on this wheel. And then to break down silos and take on more of a holistic approach, we as the Maryland Highway Safety Office oversee coordination, communication, and collaboration of all of our partners. And we also try to ensure equity throughout this entire process. Last but certainly not least, at the bottom of this graphic, you'll see that all of our actions are driven by data. So similar to the safe system approach that we've all been hearing so much about over the past year, We too operate on shared responsibilities, and we feel in Maryland we have been doing this for years. We operate on safe roads, we recognize that humans do make errors, and we work toward an efficient emergency response. Those are just to name a few. Again, our focus is on preventing death and serious injuries, and most importantly, ways to change risky behavior to safer behavior, since the Highway Safety Office is responsible for that behavioral aspect of traffic safety. Excuse me. I will now turn it over to Doug Mowbray, our Traffic Records Program Manager at the Highway Safety Office, who's going to give you a snapshot of Maryland crashes. Doug?
Thank you, Myra. My name again is Doug Mowbray. I'm the Traffic Records Program Manager for the Maryland Highway Safety Office. Just a fancy way of saying I'm a data coordinator. Next slide, please. Thank you. So looking at trends and fatalities across the state of Maryland, and this rings true in each jurisdiction, we're still seeing that the behaviors related to fatal crashes kind of fall into three categories, and that's impairment, speed, and unrestrained occupants. So that's whether the driver or the passengers in the vehicle. So 2 out of every 3 fatal crashes that occur in Maryland involve some level of speeding, impairment, lack of seatbelt use, or a combination thereof. That's what that Venn diagram is in the middle. So we continue to track these trends in behaviors, and our programs are geared toward reaching out to the folks who continue to not wear their seatbelts, to drive impaired, and to speed. Good news that we can share with you is that we did an observation of seatbelt usage across the state of Maryland back in June. This is required every year that we submit to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Our seatbelt rate did increase to 92.7%. So that is the highest it's been in a couple of years. That is the good news. The bad news is that when we look at fatal crashes over the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, and the high period of the COVID pandemic, when there was a fatal crash, over 40% of the occupants in those vehicles were not belted. So there's still a high number of people who are choosing not to wear their belts and getting into crashes. But bouncing back to some good news again, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Frederick County all saw increases in their seatbelt rates in 2022. Charles County was the exception for that. Next slide, please. So we do keep track of trends. Like I said, this is just a 3-year snapshot for all of Maryland. We provide these statistics on a regular basis for all jurisdictions, and I'll get into some of those slides in a second. But one of the things that we are tracking and has become a huge focus for us is obviously non-motorists. That is a big focus in the region and the state across the country. We are now at this point in Maryland, 1 out of every 4 fatal crashes involves a non-motorist. That's any pedestrian or a bicyclist. So that is a concerning trend. Working with the State Highway Administration, another one of our units, the Highway Safety Office is part of the Motor Vehicle Administration. Our partners at State Highway have been developing a pedestrian safety action plan to address these issues. And if we have any questions about that, we have some representatives online. Next slide, please. So earlier this year, we launched and really built up our website, zerodeathsmaryland.org. A lot of resources on this website, all of our program areas, all of our information about applying for grants, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for my area, for data, we provide a lot of data resources on zerodeathsmaryland.gov. Next slide, please. Again, tracking fatal crashes. These are fatal crashes to date. So most of our programs are really looking at historical trend data, but we are providing on about a weekly basis updates for the whole state and each jurisdiction fatalities, and we do summarize that per jurisdiction and by whether it's a driver, a passenger, bicyclist, or pedestrian. Next slide, please. As you can see here, and I'm sure this is probably not any surprise to you, but about 1 out of 3 fatal crashes in Maryland does occur in your region with Prince George's County, Montgomery, Frederick, and Charles. So that is why we do have a lot of work to do here in the region, but our support is heavily favored toward the region and Baltimore region too, where that's where a lot of our fatal crashes are. The map on the right is your equity emphasis areas in the region. We are working on a project right now to identify the seatbelt usage rates in the equity emphasis areas. So if we can see if we can kind of, identify, drivers and occupants who might not be belted, in those crashes, and seeing how that is related to different equity concerns in the region. Next slide, please. One of the things that we provide every year to the region are performance targets. So I know these are not Vision Zero targets. The Maryland, state of Maryland is a Vision Zero state, but these targets are provided on an annual basis, and they align with the Maryland Strategic Highway Safety Plan's targets. These are federally required. They have to be data driven. We are showing, milestones each year to get toward where we need to be. Obviously, our aspirational goal is zero. But these are based off of the linear trend model that our colleagues from the National Study Center who are online develop each year. As we can see, the last couple of years, fatalities have been going up. Next slide, please. But serious injuries have been going down. So, in 2020, we saw fatalities go up across the country, and in Maryland, bit of an anomaly with VMT being down. But again, that silver lining is we continue to see serious injuries decline, and we attribute a lot of that to a lot of the patient care that we have, especially in Maryland. We have a great patient care system with trauma and EMS. So we're continuing to see injuries decline in Maryland, and also improvements to vehicles and roadways. Next, please. Just continuing with additional targets that are required by federal law that we coordinate with the region each year. Next slide, please. And this is the fatality rate. Next slide, please. And the serious injury rate. Next slide, please. All right, back to Myra.
Thank you, Doug. So as I said earlier, we do operate with numerous partners throughout the state. We supply resources, and we have a strong outreach department, as well as looking for partners that can help us with outreach and education. In the National Capital Region for fiscal year 22, we allocated $1.7 million on projects that meet all these requirements. Some of the most notable projects, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, is the Street Smart campaign. We also provided funding to the Frederick Department of Health through Frederick Safe Kids. They did some incredible outreach with bicyclist safety, pedestrian safety, not only helmet education, but helmet distribution in some of the Title I schools, through some of the Title I schools. And this funding covers impaired driving, occupant protection, pedestrian education, as well as enforcement. Next slide, please. So for the federal fiscal year of 2023, which began in October, statewide, we were given $13.1 million. Now, at the time that we created this slide presentation, when we tabulated what we have in our electronic grant system, which means those grants that have been signed, sealed, and delivered, we were at about $878,000 committed to the National Capital Region. However, there are some outstanding grants that we should
Myra, we lost you.
Myra, we lost your sound.
in on time.
There you
We
are.
are looking for those through mid-year grants. And then for federal fiscal year 2024, our applications open January 9th. Again, we are definitely looking for additional partners, new partners throughout the state, especially those in underserved areas. And we've already started working to identify agencies in equity emphasis areas that may be interested in applying for the behavioral grants that we offer through the Maryland Highway Safety Office. Next slide, please. Our contacts are listed on the slide above. Dr. Tim Kearns is our director. I'm the deputy. And of course, today joining us, we have Doug, our data coordinator and traffic records program manager. And thank you for allowing us this time to talk.
Well, thank you, Myra and Doug, for joining us for that presentation. I do see one question in the chat, but that to me looks more like a Q&A session rather than a kind of question rather than a clarifying question. I don't know, maybe I'd ask the chair to weigh in on that and
I would agree.
see if there's any other quick clarifying questions. And if not, we're going to transition to the speaker in the room here. Stephen Reed from the Virginia Department of Transportation has joined us here in the room, and I'm going to cede the podium to him for his presentation. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me. As a former Prince William DPW staff, former Northern Virginia staff with Conti, it's good to be back with you all. Here we go. Next slide. Real quickly, the other two presenters set me up very well for some of the details that they're working on that mirror what we're doing in Virginia. I'm going to go over our new 5-year strategic plan and the emphasis areas that are there, talk about our crash trends, focusing on the pandemic period for a couple of minutes, and then talk about how we're addressing that with our behavioral and infrastructure programs and the strategies that we have for that. And then finish up talking about our regional and locality support and outreach. So let's look at the trends. Consistent with what you hear from the other jurisdictions and nationally, the red line is our fatalities, that ugly U-shape, we call it, where things have been increasing since an all-time low in 2014. With those trends continuing, unfortunately, year to date, we're up another 12% in Virginia, and a much larger percentage for our vulnerable users. And so there's a concern there, like you've heard from both DC and Maryland. And also troubling is this flattening or leveling of the serious injury that are occurring from crashes. And so with those trends going on, just a note about our target setting, with that increase that you're seeing in fatalities and that leveling in the serious injuries, our board this past year decided that we could submit our data-driven federal targets following those trends, but that would set more aspirational state targets to follow our strategic highway safety plan, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So we just finished updating our plan for 2022 through 2026 with a similar vision as before, towards zero. And with that, we have set a goal that follows our VTrans 2045, our long-range plan of Virginia, of having fatalities and serious injuries in that time period. So that equates to about a 2% per year reduction through the 5-year period of the plan, with that increasing over the next 25 years. The mission, as you've seen from Maryland, is to fulfill that vision through the safe system approach with the 4 E's that were mentioned. And we've added a 5th E, which is safe travel for everyone. So that's for everyone and also with everyone in terms of changing our community's consciousness about safety and talking about safe people like we heard in DC. There's a bit.ly link there to the plan for those that are interested. And again, using the federal highways safe system wheel, we've adopted that in our plan as well. And we've taken the guiding principles that you see there on the left down there, and we've turned those into strategies. For example, to be proactive in terms of where we're acting and sharing responsibility across the E's and with everyone. And then at the bottom, that our actions will consider equity in terms of risk We've heard about that with our vulnerable users and also to our underserved populations. So we have 5 guiding strategies in the plan that are sort of the umbrella over the emphasis areas. And so we've taken our emphasis areas and grouped them into the safe system areas that you heard from DC: safe users, vehicles, speeds, roads, and post-crash care. And we've added 3 there: aging road users, and those are citizens over 65 that are drivers or vulnerable users, motorcyclists, and our heavy vehicles, our large trucks, being slotted under safe vehicles that you see there. And so with so many emphasis areas, we really tried to focus the plan this time to look at sort of our top 10 actions. And so within each of these, you'll see a listing of those actions and the partners that are involved with implementing those actions. Just a little discussion about the data. Along the top, you'll see bar graphs for each of the emphasis areas that are fatalities. And the bottom set of bar graphs are our serious injuries. And I've outlined 2 of those that are troubling to us through the pandemic period with increases, and that's the speeding related. You can see the jump there. A little drop in 2020 with speeding, serious injuries, but an increasing trend with that and with occupant protection. And the overlap of that you saw from Maryland in the Venn diagram of them sort of all coming together there. But also the arrows are pointing out a couple of other trends that we're monitoring there with young drivers as well that are coming back into the system and the outreach to our young drivers. And with our aging road population, you can see it going up and down a little bit there with the fatalities, but that increase here in 2021 is troubling, and so outreach through our Grand Driver program is being beefed up to address some of those issues. Now, in terms of our strategies, we had a transportation bill that increased our safety funding for the first time with a set aside for both behavioral and infrastructure. And with that came the requirement that we develop a strategy annually that's approved by our Commonwealth Transportation Board. And of course, IIJA has increased the proportions as well. So on the infrastructure side, as I reported, I think last time we got together, we're shifting towards more systemic, low cost, across the network countermeasures that I'll show in a couple of slides here. And for behavioral, we're going to be spending that additional state safety funds on some key emphasis areas. And so now our funding is over $100 million a year, and we've put aside about 20% of that for our locally maintained network and projects on that network for infrastructure, as I'll show as well. So for behavior, our Department of Motor Vehicles Highway Safety Office looked at the trends, particularly coming out of COVID in 2021 and early 2022, and identified the same 3 as Maryland of unrestrained, speeding, and impaired. And our impaired numbers there involve the 4 Ds of impairment: drunk, drugged, distracted, and drowsy. And of course, our vulnerable users. And so with about $10 million extra per year, the $30 million, you can see about a third on the top 2, and then slightly less for impaired, and then a little over 10% for the pedestrian outreach and education that's going on across the state and in different regions. Now for our systemic plan for infrastructure, we were heading towards this last time that we spoke. We're now up to almost 80% of our funds being spent on these low-cost countermeasures for roadway departure to keep people on the road. And so with the rumble strip program, that's going strong behind our paving, as well as the safety edge, which is that wedge on the edge of that's formed on the edge of pavement rather than a vertical drop-off that allows people to recover if there's rutting or sort of edge drop-off there on the edge of pavement. and then, of course, our curb signing following the federal requirements for that as well. At intersections, our other big emphasis area, we've pretty much completed out our high visibility black plates. If you've driven across the Commonwealth, you should be seeing those pretty much everywhere. And we've done a lot of work with flashing yellow arrow for those permitted left turn movements. We're now getting into spending more funds on our unsignalized intersections with redundant and repetitive signing and marking for those unsignalized intersections that have crashes and risks. And then, of course, for our pedestrians, the highest risk is crossing the road. And so we're putting a lot of our funds into pedestrian accommodations at signals and mid-block crossings with additional traffic control devices. For our localities, and that 20% that I mentioned, the same sort of countermeasures, but we've also added the road diets, the reutilization of the pavement width there, hopefully to get some pedestrian accommodations into the footprint. And then the other same sort of intersection and one roadway departure. We have some cities down at Hampton Roads that used to be counties and have some very rural curves to deal with. It's a busy slide with a lot of the funding. Just to let you know that originally back in 2020 when we started with this implementation, we had about $152 million. We're now up to $520 million extra dollars. And you see the top line there that we're spending about $110 million of that spread across the Commonwealth to localities that have submitted for funding. I believe we received a few projects from Northern Virginia from one jurisdiction. And you can see at the bottom there, as I move on, that we're also doing some spot projects. Now, in terms of our outreach, technical assistance, as you did in 2019, we started working with other MPOs and TPOs to do some safety planning. We would do the analysis for them, and hopefully they would come up with their action plan and strategies from that analysis of finding their high injury networks and their focus areas, emphasis areas. Leading into that, we've had a busy year with Safe Streets for All to supplement and support them in their applications. So some of them already had the analysis done and needed to do the other requirements, and some were starting from scratch. And then we had a few localities submit for infrastructure grants, Fairfax County, Arlington here in the Northern Virginia area, that we submitted letters of support for those. And we're excited about that work. And we're starting to work on our new requirement, the Vulnerable Road User Assessment. It's a new federal highways requirement that will pivot off of our Pedestrian Safety Action Plan that we first launched in 2018, and we'll be updating that and having outreach to all of our MPOs as a requirement for that. Also at the local level, we have a safety circuit rider through our local assistance technical program at UVA, and they do road safety assessments and help with project scoping. And we've also provided safety funds for jurisdictions that are interested in doing detailed work to scope their projects and cost them and submit them for safety funding. And then finally, one that's encouraging and exciting for me is in the past we did a lot of work with our Department of Health and Injury Prevention, seatbelt use and child care, child use, seatbelt use. But now we're starting to work more with their epidemiologists on active transportation and safety. So starting through the pandemic, we formed an alliance to prioritize active transportation, health, and safety. And that pivoted off of Department of Health's Walkability Action Institute. I know a lot of the jurisdictions in Northern Virginia have been cohorts that have gone through that, and we're trying to build that so that the health community can start to work with our planning and engineering community to improve our health and active transportation outcomes. And so we've done several piloted vulnerable road user safety assessment, and we did one on Backlek Road in Fairfax County, and found right away we're able to apply the findings from that of being in the field to the systemic treatments that I mentioned for crossings. And so a lot of resources there on our new website that the Department of Health has launched recently, and we look forward to engaging with the jurisdictions of Northern Virginia on that initiative. So thank you very much, and we'll open it up for the question period.
Okay, Andrew, am I supposed to take it from here?
Yes, I would recommend that, but I can be your eyes and ears here in the room if we get hands in the room.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So now we'll turn to the joint question and answer session from members to all of our panelists. Feel free to ask questions either for a particular panelist or jointly for all our panelists. Due to this unique situation and to give preference to those that are there in person, please raise your hand if you have questions, and the staff will get your names to me to be called on, and then we will do the raised hands online. I do know that there's some questions in the chat, Andrew. I appreciate everyone's cooperation and patience with this process. So, Andrew, do we want to start with the ones in the chat box while people let me know if there's questions in the room?
We have 2 hands up in the room, I can tell you that.
Okay.
So,
Well,
to open up.
do you want to start with the ones in the chat box, and then they'll get me the names of the ones in the room?
Yes.
Yeah, Ms. Sebeski, those in the room, Ms. Umstead, Ms. Wheeler, then Mr. Arundrich, Gary Arundrich. Those are the 3 people in the room.
Earl.
And Earl Lewis from MDOT.
Okay, I missed one. Wheeler, Gary, Lewis.
Kristen Umstead
Umstead.
from Loudoun County.
Yep. Okay, so if we want to start with the people in the room, I'll just start with Ann Wheeler.
Great, thank you. And this is probably more towards Virginia information. I mean, I assume we're going to get the presentations afterwards. Is there anywhere where some of the detailed information, like percent of pedestrian, crashes involved, like, and then fatalities? Where's some of the detailed information behind some of this stuff that were presented? Is that online?
Good question. So we have a high-level dashboard on the VDOT website.
Okay.
That just talks about fatalities and serious injuries as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
We have a tool that's available to local jurisdictions to filter and look at the data in their jurisdiction that's available, and I can provide a link to that tool.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have Ms. Umstead.
Actually, could I was just going to add, if you don't mind, that the materials for today's work session on the website for the work session include the presentations as were supplied to us. And also there's the introductory memorandum for today's work session has some links, including links to the TPB's own safety study, which had a number of deep dive data issues. And so there's some good resources there in the meeting materials. Thank you.
All right, Kristen Olmsted.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Conti. In Loudoun County, we have a project for the widening of Route 15 North from Leesburg to Point of Rocks, Maryland, in part to accommodate about 16,000 vehicles that come from Frederick County and western Montgomery County and use that route to commute. One of the reasons we're widening it is because we cannot get ambulances and fire engines up that road when there is a crash. There are no shoulders. There's only one lane in each direction. So as we try to incorporate the post-crash care approach with a road widening approach, how do we make those two mesh? Do we emphasize that this is in large part a post-crash care project? Does that give us any advantage in getting any kind of funding from the state or federal government?
That's a great question, and I'm hoping at the scoping and through the design phase that there's outreach with the first responders in terms of identifying those issues. particularly when it comes to just providing the shoulder, the shoulder width for recovery and for diverting, traffic around the crash scene. So I think that's the first line for that. In terms of funding, the transportation funding is going to be a little bit different than the first responders funding, but I do know we have a pretty strong state traffic incident management group in Virginia, and so I'm hoping that those concerns are funneled up, from the locality through that group in terms of coordinating the response there in your jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Ms.
Gary?
Sebesky, Mr.
I was going to go
Arundrich
with
was
the people
next,
from
and-
Maryland now.
Yeah, Mr. Arundrich and then Earl Lewis.
Yeah. So so Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gary Arundrich, Montgomery County. The presentations were fascinating. I like to see the data. I appreciate the thinking that's gone into prioritizing safety issues and approaches. When the study was done a few years ago that was referenced, the COG TPB study, it was obvious to me that there is a very distinct difference between fatalities and serious injuries based on jurisdiction. Variations by state and variations within the state, particularly Prince George's County and Montgomery County, where the largest differences. Has TPB staff or any of the other the states tried to compare and look at similarities and differences between your approaches and your data to try to explain some of the large variations that we see, or at least I thought we saw previously?
We'll defer to Maryland staff in terms of what their data approach is, and then we can add. Doug or Myra, would any of you want to respond?
Sure. Hi, this is Doug Mowbray again with the Maryland Highway Safety Office. So a couple of, in the last federal highway safety bill, which was the FAST Act, there was a requirement that all states move toward using a standard for identifying injury severity on the crash report. So that I know that by now, all the states within the region have adopted the injury severity coding on their respective crash reports. So at least on that score, Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and the jurisdictions, and everybody's using those crash reports, the officers are using the same coding. Now, what we haven't done, and what I suspect is the case, is that training is probably not consistent across the states as far as officers being able to identify appropriately injury severity. Officers are not trained medical professionals, so the difference between a serious injury 04 and a suspected injury 03, that is really up to the hospital to decide, or EMS providers to indicate. So we have seen the data kind of flip-flop over the years as we've changed the coding and as officers get used to that coding. But this is why we're working with partners like the University of Maryland National Study Center to actually track and connect that crash data back to the hospital records so we can get a more accurate view of injury severities. I'm not familiar, sorry, if Virginia and DC is doing the same thing, but I know that there's a national effort to do more data integration and connect the crash data to the hospital records. I think if we do more of that, then Maryland can compare with DC and Virginia its integrated data sets. I think that's something that we aspire to right now.
Okay.
This is Charlie. Excuse me. This is Charlie from DDAT. I can just say, yeah, we're working on the same idea of integrating the trauma data, but still in progress. Yep.
Thank you, Charlie. Earl Lewis
You don't want to
next.
comment, or if not, we'll go to Earl Lewis.
Yeah, Ms. Sebesky, Earl Lewis is next.
Again, thank you all for being here today. It's very much appreciated. I know that the IIJA required within the first 2 years each state to complete a vulnerability road user safety assessment. And I know you've already talked about that in your presentation, so it's great that that's already been started by jurisdictions in the region. I just want to ask all three jurisdictions, is there additional funding in the IIJA that's going to be helpful to our mission here in terms of traffic safety? I know it was a focus. I know there's continual funding for Safe Routes to Schools, Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP. the Highway Safety Improvement Program, Safe Streets for all funding, reconnecting community pilot programs and things of that nature. How have you all looked at potential opportunities to help leverage that funding to, take home the message that we need to all the folks involved in making our streets safe?
Okay, and this is open to all three state DOTs. Maybe I'll start with Stephen from VDOT right here.
Yeah, I think the biggest one in my mind that I've seen is the Safe Streets for All in terms of the increase there. And we have 3 Vision Zero jurisdictions in Virginia, and hopefully with some of the safety planning work, we can get others to be ready for the infrastructure side. So I think we'll need to do some work, to spend a year or more to get the plans in place, and then hopefully jump onto the infrastructure side. Of course, the other ones like connecting communities and whatnot will be helpful. And there is some work going on in Richmond with other transportation funds to do similar work even before that grant is finalized. So those are the big ones, I think, that are in addition to the extra funds coming out of the bill in Virginia.
Okay, Charlie from DDOT, any thoughts on the magnitude and the opportunities for enhanced investment for safety projects?
The enhanced resources are going to be welcome and well used for sure. Unfortunately, DDOT does not get to compete for the Safe Streets for All unless we work something else out with USDOT in our status as a state and a local.
Gotcha. Thank you. Doug, any thoughts from you or Myra?
Thanks again. This is Doug Mowbray with the Highway Safety Office. So just speaking of behavioral programs, the Highway Safety Office manages funding from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, which is limited to education and enforcement. In this past round, the federal legislation kind of relaxed the rules on being able to qualify for additional distracted driving funding. And there's also another program called the 1906 Racial Profiling Program. So Maryland now has qualified for additional funding to focus on distracted driving and also the 1906 Racial Profiling Program. So at least on the behavior side, we're seeing increases in those two program areas. I don't know if Myra has any other updates.
I just wanted to add and alert everyone that Doug did put it into the chat. There was a slide that was missing in our presentation. It was a map of Maryland that shows those jurisdictions and counties that have already started or have finished their Vision Zero plans. Most recently, we've talked with Allegheny County, who is getting moving on their plan, and as Doug said in the chat, the Tri-County Council. So we do believe that through those programs and those groups coming together, there will be some more requests through them for the infrastructure funding. But as Doug said, our office is really focusing, thank you, there we go. We are focusing on the behavioral side of the NHTSA funding grants.
Thank you, Myra. This is Kanti. Just if I might add to what the three jurisdictions have said, in terms of opportunities for increased funding, particularly coming out of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, yes, there is increased level of funding for existing safety programs. Yes, there are some new safety programs. However, I think what the federal administration and what today all three presenters have talked about is looking at safety as a systems approach. And this goes to the question that Ms. Umstead asked on the Route 15, where one might see that as an infrastructure roadway widening project, but one of the critical needs it is meeting is one of safety, and particularly the post-crash care treatment that is a critical element of safe systems approach. So Investment Infrastructure Jobs Act also increased funding for all programs or most all federal programs. So if there is an infrastructure project that any of the member jurisdictions are working on, it would really be an opportunity in their purpose and need phase of the project to examine the safety implications, and as Stephen responded, to make that based on some data analysis to show how that safety aspect of it. By doing that, the jurisdictions might have an opportunity to qualify those projects for fundings that are not necessarily limited to safety projects, because there is a significant increase in funding across the board from IJA. Ms. Sebesky, I don't see any other hands up in the room here. Andy, would you look at any questions? There was a question in the chat, I thought. Do you want to read
Yes,
that?
Ms. Russell had a question from a while back in the chat. Do you want me to read it, or does she want to announce it yourself?
Ms. Russell?
You can read it for me, thank you.
All right, so the statement is, for Maryland, our ability to use speed cameras is limited to work and school zones. We know cameras are effective. Are there efforts to work with the legislature to remove these barriers? Has there been any movement on reciprocity in the region? Do you want me to, I mean, I can tell what I know, unless Conti, you know, as you might recall, the TPB sent a letter regarding reciprocity in December of 2020 to the governors and the mayor. And I am not aware of any responses from any of the three jurisdictions to those letters that we have received. I was aware that there was one bill that was considered in the Maryland legislature and then withdrawn after some discussion. So we're not aware of any legislative action at all on this, at least in Maryland or Virginia.
Okay.
I can't speak for DC.
I don't have anything to add to that. I will turn to first Maryland, Doug Armida, on the question, are there any legislative efforts or ideas of expanding the ability in Maryland jurisdictions to have speed cameras outside of those limited work zones? And then I will turn to Stephen for the same question in Virginia.
Yes, there has been a little bit of movement towards cameras outside of work zones and the school zones. A couple of examples that come to mind are Interstate 83, where there are now active speed cameras, and Indian Head Highway. From our standpoint, it may be of interest to know that we are working currently on a project that is studying the effectiveness of speed cameras, not just the area prior to the camera and within the zone of the camera, but what's happening to driver behavior just past that camera zone. Once we finalize that project, we hope that's going to be a really important and useful tool for legislators as they discuss, you know, the topic of cameras, increasing the number, increasing the locations, and possibly, you know, getting more outside of those work zones and school zones.
Thank you, Myra. Stephen, do you want to?
Yes, really quick in Virginia. So we also have enabling legislation for school zones and work zones. It's taken us a while to get the work zone contract RFP developed and through procurement. I believe that's getting ready to be launched for a vendor to support our state police on that. And so we're looking forward to that, to see the effectiveness of that. In terms of school zones, we had a safety summit this past May where we heard from Manassas Park and the city of Falls Church that they're at different stages of implementing that, and some really good outcomes from Manassas Park. So we're hoping to continue to evaluate that. And I know that Arlington received a grant from the council to look at where to put school zone speed cameras, and we're looking forward to seeing a best practice for that and spreading that across the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
All right, Dave Snyder has his hand up in the online, and he probably will be our last question because it's 11:42. So go ahead, Mr. Snyder, but please keep that in mind.
Madam Chair, and thanks for everyone involved in the presentation today. So a question, one of the things that if you think about traffic safety as being a triad, the vehicle, the highway, and the driver, or the highway user. So we don't regulate the vehicle. We've got a lot of discussion today and a lot of programs for the highway, but yet we see the behavior of drivers all over this region deteriorate dramatically since the pandemic and after the pandemic. Is it and we realize that automatic enforcement, electronic enforcement is critical. We have severe limitations on that in Virginia, which we need to relax somehow legislatively. But can we share best practices on what's actually worked to change behavior of drivers? Because this continues to be a challenge. We see it all over the place. Our own drivers coming into the city. So can we exchange best practices on what has actually worked to improve driving behavior? That might be a critical part of how we drive down some of these terrible numbers. Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for allowing me to ask this question.
So this is Kanti Srikanth from the TPB perspective. The TPB's safety committee, as well as the bike ped pedestrian committee, does regularly hold webinars and forums where best practices are shared. In fact, recently on October 27th, the TPB hosted a webinar on best practices in pedestrian enforcement for police officers. So that is something for at the TPB level we continue to focus on. We try to hold at least a couple of such webinars every year. And we can continue to work closely with the state safety engineers in terms of making localities and TPB members aware of any state-level coordination and work activities. With that, I will just briefly turn to Charlie and Doug and Stephen or Myra if you want to add anything to Mr. Snyder's question.
I can add very quickly that from our standpoint, from the Maryland Highway Safety Office, our NHTSA regional office has started regular meetings with the entire region. And in those meetings, one of the sessions we always hold is a best practice session. And some of us are called on to present things that the NHTSA regional office knows we're doing. Other times it's kind of not so much a free for all, but we're allowed to add information as we see fit. And I do believe we're also trying to work on some more border to border enforcement throughout the regions. You know, DC and Prince George's County was the most recent example that comes to mind, but we are working with our NHTSA regional office to try to share some more best practices. Yes, we're working on that.
Thank you, Myra.
Yeah, in Virginia, with the extra money that I mentioned coming from the state side, with less strings attached, we're doing some diving into the data at our highway safety office to look at, down at the jurisdictional level, what are the focus areas and people groups that we need to reach in terms of that outreach and education. And also doing some focus group work in terms of the campaigns that will be spent there. So, we're seeing it being more localized. It's a broad range across the Commonwealth that we need to have perhaps different messages for that. And it's my understanding that our Highway Safety Office is going to have a position to focus specifically on the underserved community. So I think there's going to be a lot of good outreach and trying to change that consciousness that I mentioned earlier with that extra funding.
Thank you, Stephen.
Madam Chair, I just would call everyone's attention. There were some good questions and answers in the chat regarding traffic calming on arterials and on the recent legalization of cannabis in Maryland. So we'll try to include that in our summary of the work session. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, that's all the time we have. Want to thank our speakers and all the board members who could join us for this very good, very informative work session. Staff will provide a brief recap of the work session under agenda item number 7 at this afternoon's TPB meeting. Materials from the work session will be posted on the TPB website, and they will send out answers to all of us as they always do. Again, thank you all for joining us today. TPB members who are logged in online may remain online, and this connection will continue for the main meeting that will start at noon. However, we recommend that you do mute your line and turn off your camera in the meantime, or you may log off altogether and log back in. Thank you again. This concludes the work session, and we'll see everybody in just a few more minutes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ruben.
Good afternoon, Pam. How are you?
Well, I have been better, but could be worse as well. Thank you for asking.
You look great.
Oh, you're so kind. I have COVID. That's why I'm not there.
Okay, all right. Well, you wear it well. Okay.
Oh. Fortunately, being vaccinated, I think it's a relatively mild case, but I didn't want to get anyone sick. And
Right.
you know, I somehow I've managed to avoid it for all this time, which seems somewhat miraculous in and of itself when you look at how much exposure I'm sure I've had.
Well, I don't know if I shared with you, but in the heart of the election, our primary election, that's when I caught it.
Oh.
You know, like 2 weeks before, or actually a week before the primary election, I caught it and I had to shut down everything. So believe me, it was frustrating having to go through that. So.
Oh yeah, but what can you do? I mean,
Right?
Yes, sir. Are we ready?
Yeah, in about 30 seconds, some people are coming back to their places with food. So in about 30 seconds, we'll be set to go.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you, Conti. But yeah, Robin, that's very frustrating. And I can only imagine that close to a primary, and yeah, that's.
Well, fortunately, everything worked out well. So,
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I regret I'm not there with you for this great lunch that we know we always have in November. I'm Pam Sebeski. I'm the chair of the Transportation Planning Board, and I call the TPB's November 16th, 2022 meeting to order. I welcome everyone that is there in person and those joining us virtually. I trust the audio and video connections are working well for those participating virtually. As always, please call, email, or text staff if you are experiencing any technical difficulties. Just for those of you who weren't at the work session, I'm letting everyone know I became ill yesterday and I'm COVID positive. So to keep everyone safe, especially during this upcoming holiday season, it was agreed that it was best for me to conduct this meeting virtually today. Please be patient with me though as we try yet another new process. We continue to live stream the audio and video of this meeting on TPB's YouTube channel. I will briefly review the process staff as for this hybrid meeting. Members in the room, please use the microphone when you speak, and please be close to the microphone so that those of us online and those watching the broadcast can hear you. Those participating online, a friendly reminder to mute your microphones always, and importantly, mute your mic and state your name and jurisdiction when you speak. Members who are participating virtually, please know the staff is monitoring the chat, so feel free to post your comments or questions in the chat and staff will get it to me. You can also use the raised hand icon if you wish to be recognized. For today, during discussion and votes, those in person should raise their hands and staff will make a list of names and get them to me so I can recognize each person in turn. After the in-person members have asked questions, then I will turn to those online with raised hands. The plan is for everyone to get a chance to ask their questions by one means or another. While we have started accepting the public in person, we are continuing the practice of receiving public comments online. After staff's roll call today, I will first recognize members of the public who are here to provide their comments, and then I will ask staff to report on comments received online. A copy of comments received online is available to us on the meeting webpage. Okay, Lynn, would you please take roll call of the board members participating in the meeting today and confirm that we indeed do have a quorum?
Great, thank you, Chair Sebeski. So I'm going to list your district or jurisdiction or agency, and if you please state your name. I will also monitor the chat, and I do recognize there are some folks still eating, so I'll keep an eye out there as well. So let's start with the District of Columbia, District Council, Ms. Pinto. District Council, Charles Allen.
I'm here.
District Council, Christina Henderson. District Department of Transportation.
Anna Chamberlain here.
Great, thank you. District Office of Planning.
Dan Emerine is here.
Thanks, Dan. Moving on to Maryland, City of Bowie.
Maddie Bizzardo, present.
Thanks, Maddie. Charles County.
Ruben Collins, present.
Thank you. College Park. Frederick County.
Mark Mishler, present.
Thanks, Mark. City of Frederick.
Kelly Russell, present.
Thanks, Kelly. City of Gaithersburg.
Neil Harris is present.
Thanks. City of Greenbelt. City of Laurel. Montgomery County.
Gary Ehrenrich is present.
Thanks. Anyone else from Montgomery County? Thanks. Prince George's County.
Councilmember Glass is here.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mr. Glass. I got Mr. Glass for Montgomery County, Vic Weisberg for Prince George's County. Anybody else from Prince George's County? City of Rockville. We got a note. She has an emergency. Tacoma Park.
Casey Kostick.
Thanks, Casey. Maryland Department of Transportation.
Earl Lewis, present.
Thanks. Maryland House of Delegates. Thanks, Mark. Oh, there he is. I was like, I heard a voice, and I was like, I didn't see it online. There he is. He's in the room. Thanks. Maryland Senate. Moving on to Virginia, City of Alexandria. Arlington County.
Takis Currington is present online.
Thanks, Takis. City of Fairfax.
David Meyer, present.
Thanks, David. Fairfax County. Falls Church.
Dave Snyder here for the City of Falls Church.
Thanks. Fauquier County.
Adam Schellenberger here.
Thanks. Loudoun County.
Kristen Umstadt, present.
Anyone else from Loudoun? City of Manassas.
Pam Sebeski, present.
Thank you. City of Manassas Park.
Jeanette Rischel here.
Thanks. Prince William County.
Ann Wheeler, present.
Thank you.
Vic
Anyone else from
Langley
Prince
here.
William?
Vic
Okay,
Langley.
thank you. Gotcha. Virginia Department of Transportation.
Bill Cutler, present.
Thank you. Virginia House of Delegates.
Delegate David Reed, present.
Thank you. Virginia Senate.
Office of Senator Dave Marsden, present.
Thanks. WMATA.
Allison Davis, present.
Thank you. Moving on to our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration. Ooh, thanks, Sandra. That was too fast. Federal Transit Administration, National Capital Planning Commission, Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, and National Park Service. Again, if I missed you all, I'll monitor the chat and keep an eye out in the room. We do have a quorum, Chair Sabeski. And I do want to emphasize, when you do speak, please state your name and your locality. It really helps us when we're recording the minutes. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Since I am not there, I hope that maybe you could do me the favor of calling the names of anyone that has signed up to provide in-person comments.
Yes, we have one person that signed up, Bill Pugh. He's in the audience, and we welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Lynn. Welcome, Mr. Pugh.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bill Pugh. I'm with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you also for the safety workshop we just had. For all jurisdictions, this is a very important topic. And we've been working on the issue in particular of our dangerous arterials, where too often speed is prioritized over safety. So we're thankful for the workshop and hope this leads to further work in that area. Specifically, I want to speak about the Visualize 2045 update that you will hear about today. When this board voted in June of 2021 to essentially redo the plan as soon as it was passed, we know that the intention was to create a substantially different process and to lead to a better outcome that more closely met the regional policy goals that you all have adopted here through TPB and also through COG. From a public's perspective, we're struggling to see how the process that's proposed is substantially different than what we just went through. And we know there's a lot of staff time, both your own staffs and TPB staff. This costs, from what I can tell from the budget documents, about $5 to $7 million. So this is a lot to go through. And we want to make sure that this is a meaningfully different process that leads to better outcomes. And we know the public was not satisfied with the last plan. If you look at the comments, if you look at the voices of the region survey, the public really wants a different direction. And I know most of you do too. The policy goals point towards that. But what we've been told is, instead of the preparing new climate-friendly build scenario, instead of a more accountable zero-based budgeting process, what we're going to have is read this 50-page memo, tell us if your projects are, if you think your projects are consistent with regional policies that are generally worded, and then we'll put the projects in the plan, and then right before you vote on them, we'll let the public give feedback. And what we think alternatively would help would be to give public input up front. That we often hear from TPB staff that the public input comes too late in the process. So we think public input while local jurisdictions are considering their projects for the zero-based budget would help, so that there's feedback to local officials. They can decide and incorporate that in their project selections before they submit. The other thing is we would like some performance targets on.
So that's 3 minutes, by the way.
Okay. And we also want to revisit the decision on scenarios, and the board can give more time to staff if it needs it. So we thank you for your efforts and look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, Mr. Pugh. Lynn, is there any comments received electronically that you would like to summarize for the benefit of the board?
Yes, great. Thank you, Chair Sebeski. So between the October 2022 TPB meeting and noon on Tuesday, November 15th, the TPB received 7 comments submitted via email. A memo with the summary of these comments, as well as the actual comments themselves and all the letters, can be found on our TPB meeting page. Tad Aburn, a retired Maryland Department of the Environment representative on MWAC, submitted a letter and attachments providing comment on a proposed District of Columbia bus maintenance facility project on Claybrick Road near Cheverly, Maryland. Rick Rybeck submitted an email providing comment on the 2024 Long Range Transportation Plan's update, the financial plan assumptions. Charlie Grimes submitted an email encouraging prioritization of pedestrian safety improvements. Bethany Usher submitted an email encouraging prioritization of various bicycle and pedestrian improvements. Jem Bingle from the Piedmont Environmental Council submitted an email addressed to the Loudoun County representatives encouraging prioritization of pedestrian improvements. Noble Smith, a faculty assistant at the University of Maryland, submitted an email and a letter providing comment on the proposed District of Columbia bus maintenance facility project on Claybrick Road near Cheverly, Maryland. Lastly, Sonia Brehe from the Coalition for Smarter Growth submitted an email addressed to the Fairfax County members encouraging prioritization of pedestrian improvements. So as I mentioned, these comments are all found on our meeting page. That concludes my brief summary, Chair Sebeski. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. So as always, we will start with review of the approval of the minutes of the October 19th, 2022 meeting. I invite a motion to adopt the minutes as provided. Please state your name and jurisdiction as you make the motion.
So moved, Madam Chair. Takis Karantonis, Arlington County.
Thank you, Takis. Is there a second?
Patty Pizzurdo, second. City of Bowie.
Thank you. Are there any corrections or additions to the meeting minutes? I'm hearing and I'm assuming seeing none since I've heard nothing from staff. For the vote then, are there any nays or abstentions from anyone in the room? Okay, from those online.
Don't see any.
Okay, good. From those of us online, any nays or abstentions from the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, DC, or other agencies? Okay. Now to the technical committee report. We have a written summary of the November 4th meeting. I will recognize Matt Arcieri, the chair of the technical committee. Matt, is there any thing that you would like to highlight or expand on?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the TPB. You have my written summary of the November 4th Technical Committee. Of course, we talked about the work session that just concluded and the items that are on your agenda coming up, including the draft targets for highway and transit safety. We did receive a briefing on ongoing work on the 2024 Long Range Plan update, which you will receive a briefing on as well in your upcoming meeting, and also some really interesting stuff from WMATA on their bus listing session and an overview of the technical project info track that we use to set up some of this work. And with that, I stand ready for any questions.
All right, so are there any questions for Mr. Arcieri? From there in the room? Okay, then we're going to go online and anyone from DC, Maryland, Virginia, WMATA, or other agencies? Okay, thank you, Mr. Arcieri. Appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Moving along. Now to the Community Advisory Committee report. We have a written summary of the November 10th meeting. I will recognize Ashley Hudson, chair of the CAC. Ashley, is there anything you would like to highlight or expand on?
Yes, thank you, Chair Sebeski, and hello all. The Community Advisory Committee met last Thursday for an online-only meeting. There were 13 members in attendance, all of whom were engaged in the conversation at one point or another. First, we received a briefing on the long-range plan update from Stacy Cook. She highlighted the process for updating the plan, some of the target goals that guide their work, as well as the review process for projects currently in the plan. An example of the goals that guide their work was zero-based budgeting, which sparked some questions about why projects might be removed from the plan. Then we discussed recruitment for the 2023-2024 CAC term. the group had an open brainstorm about the ideal CAC candidate. You can see a full list of the characteristics the group came up with captured in John Swanson's report, but I'll share some of my favorites. A good attribute for a CAC candidate is actively engaged in their community so they can be conduits for sharing information. Balanced in the sense that a member should be locally oriented but able to consider the bigger picture, and a general desire to make our communities a better place for all. So that was a summary. We brainstormed different ideas of what makes us a solid CAC candidate. We looked within and also thought about people that aren't in our group. Last, we received a briefing on the 2022 State of the Commute Survey from Nick Ramfoss. The data looked vastly different from a similar survey conducted pre-pandemic, so we were assured the findings of this survey do in fact result from the surge of telework. CAC members were interested in breaking down the data by age and gender and wanted more information about slug lines. Nick told us the full survey report would be available to jurisdiction staff and by request to the public. So I also want to add the 13 folks that attended this virtual meeting from 6 to 8 p.m. on a Thursday night really care about what happens in their communities and in transportation. So we all want to say thank you for the opportunity to be involved, and that will conclude my report. I will gladly take any questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the great information. Are there any questions for Ashley from anyone there in the room?
Yes, Ms. Casey Kostick has a question.
Okay, Ms. Kostick, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the report and your work, as well as the work of all the CAC members. I was really interested in your discussion of the long-range plan update, and I know we have this on our agenda later to get into a little more in depth, but I thought it was an interesting question that you noted about what would cause a project to be taken out of the plan, as well as some of the implications of the zero-based budgeting, and just curious sort of what the discussion was around that, and what members thought, as well as what you heard from staff and what staff perspective was as well.
Yeah, what I gathered from Stacy's response, and Lynn chimed in as well, is that some of the projects that are already allotted funding will stay in the program, and there is a goal to assume that there is no funding for future projects. So they have to be selected very carefully, with an assumption that there's very little or no funding available. I was not completely clear on what would make a project removed from the plan, but that is definitely something I plan to keep an eye on in the coming months. And I could have a completely wrong understanding, but that was my understanding.
Ms. Kostick, does that answer your question, or do you want me to?
Thank you. And maybe we can get more into that discussion during the work session item on that, unless there's something you want to add now.
Given that the question is now, just to make sure, the TPB resolution that was adopted last year for the 2024 update has a clause in it that when the TPB members, each of them, will be asked to re-examine every single project that is in the plan and resubmit them for inclusion in the plan. That's the framework. But the exception or the exemption that was written into the resolution was, if a project is already funded, then those would not be required to resubmit, meaning it would be assumed it would continue in the plan. That is what we are at the staff level reading the resolution calling those projects are exempt from resubmission. But that does not preclude any of the member agency to say, yeah, that's okay, we had spent some money on it, but we have re-examined it and we are not going to pursue the project at this time, or we are not going to pursue the project in the way it was envisioned. We are going to make some changes to it and resubmit it. So that is what would, so if there are projects in the plan that has had no money spent on it at all, then every member jurisdiction and their agencies, highway and transit agencies, are required to re-examine and reassert, yes, we still need that project. We intend to spend money on it, even though we haven't spent any money on it, And by the way, this is the way in which that project advances one or more of the TPB's goals and priorities.
And can you just briefly explain how that's different than the usual plan? Are jurisdictions not usually required to do that, and would they not usually examine all of the submissions?
Right. That's a good question. When the TPB updates its plan, it is never limited in the scope of its update, meaning every TPB member is asked to update any and all projects, programs, and policies in the plan. So theoretically, they have always been expected or had the opportunity to do that. And that has happened. There are a few projects that come to my mind that some of them were land use. If that had proceeded, we would have had a Disney theme park today in our region. That didn't happen, right? So there are a number of such projects and programs and policies that were in the plan that were re-examined and pulled back. What is, in my opinion, markedly different this time is the solicitation is explicitly sending back all of the project information that is currently residing in the TPB's plan database to every single jurisdiction and say, okay, jurisdiction X, here are the 7 highway projects and the 2 transit projects you have, re-examine them and resubmit them with the appropriate information. So that is one part of it. The second way that this update is different is we are asking every member jurisdiction to explicitly and qualitatively document how the project advances one or more of the TPB goals and priorities. That too has been an expectation all along, but this time it is more explicit. And in addition, one of the new goals that the TPB adopted, which is greenhouse gas reduction, which wasn't there in 2018 or in 2022, so that is now being added. So an explicit review of the TPB's goals and priorities as they consider resubmission is the second way that this update is different. And the third way that this update is different is the TPB has been doing a number of scenario studies. What if we did this? What if we did that, right? I mean, the question of can our transportation system perform better for all of us than what our current plans indicate has been an ongoing one for the TPB. I remember some scenario studies back in the late 70s. We did 28 different scenarios then. How could this region evolve differently? But they were all done at different points of time. I think this time the TPB has said, here are what are the basic things, or the findings, or the lessons we have learned to our what-if questions. So they're submitting that back to each member jurisdiction agency and asking them, based on these lessons that we have learned, what sorts of projects would you now propose to implement and invest your transportation fund? So those are the 3 ways in which they are being explicit, and that being the focus of this update is how it is different.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I don't see any online.
Ann Wheeler,
Yes.
Prince William
Ms.
County.
Wheeler.
Just a real quick, we're just back off her question, which is different in Virginia, where we have NVTA projects that are funded and going forward. I assume those are somewhat exempt if they've been funded and they're moving forward in review.
Yeah, that's the language in the TPB resolution, that if a project is funded.
Okay.
One of the things that we have done is the TPB has some information on the projects that are funded, and we maintain it. We have been compiling that for every single project, for every single segment of a project. There are more than 450 such segments in our plan. So we've been compiling that, and we have been working with your agency staffs to make sure that the information we have is indeed correct and up to date. It may not be, and we would be the first to acknowledge that the information we have may not be up to date. So we are working with them. So once they confirm that the funding information on these projects that we have is accurate, then those would be identified as projects that already are funded, which once again does not preclude any member agency to say, that's okay, we are not going to proceed forward with that, either in the way it was designed or proceed with that at all at this time.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. And yes, please make sure all the members know how much we appreciate the input that you all are providing to us. And we're going to move on now to the report from our director, Conti. We have a written summary of the November 4th steering committee meeting and a report of the other items of interest. Conti, is there anything else you would like to highlight and anything new to share with the board?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. You have a copy of my written report, so I won't go over it in detail. Just a brief overview. The TPB steering committee met on November 4th. It approved 2 amendments to the TIP. The first one was at the request of the District Department of Transportation, where it updated the funding for a bunch of projects under 5 different programs: maintenance program, operations program, safety programs, that sort of thing. And the changes resulted in a net addition of about $10 million for the DC's program. Details of this are on pages 4 through 18 of my report to you. The second and the last amendment that the TPB Steering Committee approved was requested by the Virginia Department of Transportation, and that was reprogramming some funds for the US 1 Farley Boulevard project, and it also updated the costs for the Richmond Highway Corridor Improvements project. Details of that amendment are on pages 19 through 25. Under the letters sent and received, I'm happy to report that we have received $150,000 in funding commitment from WMATA for the TPB's Fall Street Smart Safety campaign. This is something that WMATA does every year, so we thank WMATA for continuing that funding commitment. A couple of announcements. Recruitment for the TPB's Community Advisory Committee has begun. The appointments to the Community Advisory Committee is for a 2-year term that will begin February of 2023, and it will run through January of 2025. We request your help in sharing the information and helping recruit active, effective members for your Community Advisory Committee. There will be a total of 24 members, and board will be appointing the members at its meeting in January of next year. Your staff continues to be very active in the National Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or AMPO. Feng Shi and Ken Zhou of your staff presented some of their work at the annual conference in Minneapolis. And Tim Kanan, Nicole McCall, Stacy Cook, and Lynn Erickson moderated some national sessions at the conference. A couple of friendly reminders. First, TPB's Street Smart Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety Campaign will launch tomorrow in the District of Columbia at 11 a.m. on Wheeler Road. Mayor Bowser will be speaking, as will Director Lott, and COGS Executive Director Chuck Bean will be the MC of the event. TPB hosted a webinar on best practices in pedestrian enforcement for police officers on the 27th, and this campaign will continue to work with our police and media partners. Lastly, a friendly reminder to register for COGS annual meeting and awards program. That will be on December 14th at the Marriott Marquis, Washington, D.C. You should have received an email asking you to register for the event. If you need that resent, please let me know. We'll be happy to do that. That concludes my report, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, and thank you to the staff that did all of that work nationally. It's always good to have us recognized nationally as well. Are there any questions from Conti from anyone in the room? No. Okay, and I don't see anything online either. So we're going to move along on our agenda. Even though it is a few days early, I'd like to wish everyone a happy and healthy Thanksgiving. I am sorry to inform you that we will be bidding a goodbye to one of our colleagues on the board, Miss Casey Kostick from Tacoma Park, as she has decided not to run for re-election, so therefore will not be serving on TPB. We have a certificate of appreciation for you and for your service to the region and to the TPB. I will briefly read the certificate. For those who, I don't know if you can see it on my laptop here, but Certificate of Appreciation, the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments hereby presents this recognition of gratitude and esteem to Casey Kostick for her distinguished service to the TPB and people of the region as Transportation Planning Board member, Tacoma Park, 2018 to 2022, and Access for All Advisory Committee Chair, 2018 to 2021, and that's signed by me as the chair of this year, 2022. Casey, your service on this board has been very valuable and has helped shape our regional and transportation plans that will, as you know, go on for many years. You've made a significant difference, and I really appreciated the opportunity to work with you and wish you well in whatever your next life adventure may offer. Would you like to offer any comments?
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much. First of all, just want to really thank everyone on the board as well as the TPB staff and the AFA and the CAC members as well. It's just been a real pleasure to work with all of you and to learn from all of you. And I think I can't believe it's been 5 years since I walked into this boardroom and was sitting over there with no idea what I was doing. So it's been a great learning experience, and I think the board, from what I've seen, has taken some really great strides in the right direction on a lot of issues, including safety, which we were just talking about. We've taken some really good steps on climate change and a number of other issues during the time I've been on the board. I do think we have a long way to go still, and I really appreciate everyone's work on this. And I, hopefully will be a thorn in your side from the public commenter position at some point in time. So thank you all, and best wishes to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So the last item of my remarks, next month I will end my tenure as the chair of this body. My colleagues, Reuben Collins from Charles County and Christina Henderson from the District of Columbia will also be ending their terms as the first and second vice chairs. I have convened a nominating committee to bring back to the full board next month a slate of candidates for the chair and vice chairs. I thank Jeanette Rischel from the city of Manassas Park, Kelly Russell from the city of Frederick, and Charles Allen from the District of Columbia for serving on this nominating committee. I will not be a candidate. I hope that Reuben and Christina, however, will be returning to serve as officers next year, along with whoever the new officer from Virginia will be. Okay, before we get started with the remaining items on our agenda, under item 9 today, we will have an opportunity to provide our input to WMATA on their effort to design a better bus system for our region. I want to make sure we take all the time allocated to that agenda item. So I will keep a keen eye on the clock, as I seem to always do, to keep us on schedule. This means if we are unable to get to you for your comments or your questions on the next two items, please put them in the chat and the staff will definitely respond back to you and to all of us with that information, but it will allow us to get through everything. So with that, we're going to move on. For the benefit of those who were unable to participate in the work session this morning, we will first have Andrew Meese recap the discussion on roadway safety. Then we will have a staff brief us on the proposed updates to transit safety targets and highway safety targets that the TPB set previously. We will be asked to adopt both transit and highway safety targets at our meeting next month. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair Sebeski, and good afternoon, board members and other attendees. I'm Andrew Meese, Systems Performance Planning Director on TPB staff, and I'm going to be joined in a moment by my colleagues Eric Randall and Janie Nam for a three-part safety presentation here today, starting with a short recap of this morning's TPB work session on transportation safety, followed by presentation of the draft transit safety targets and the draft highway safety targets under the performance-based planning and programming process. Next slide, please. Oh, I can do it. There, thank you. So as you, the work session took place this morning, and this provided an opportunity for our state DOTs to provide updates on their safety activities as well as the challenges that they're facing. And you can see the scheduled speakers listed up there, and all of them did join us with the addition of Myra Weeman of the Maryland Highway Safety Office. So we thank all of them for participating. I'll just mention the names: Charlie Wilson and Christine Mayer, Douglas Mowbray, and Stephen Reed. I think it was a very good discussion, and we appreciate everybody who were able to join this morning in this. And I'll just hit a couple of highlights. You know, the district representatives talked extensively about their many efforts under their Vision Zero program. Maryland, I think, emphasized their collaboration with local jurisdictions and regions, and we saw things that they were doing in particular places around the state. And Virginia described their implementation, their widespread implementation of proven countermeasures to traffic safety issues, and a whole lot more. Following the presentations, there was a very good question and answer session that board members were able to ask questions, and I think there were some good discussions, and some of the topics that were discussed included sharing best practices interjurisdictionally, automated enforcement and reciprocity for that and the status of that, deeper dives into data to try to learn more, and funding opportunities, particularly under the new bipartisan infrastructure law that has some new programs and some new opportunities. So it appears that we did get some good news that there's more money to devote to safety. And I would call your attention on the TPB website to the calendar entry for the TPB work session. It includes, the agenda includes an introductory memo that has a lot of great links to our previous safety studies and other information that's very informative, and the three presentations from this morning are also posted there. So with that summary, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Eric Randall to begin describing the transit safety targets.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm here for the 5th time this year to talk about performance-based planning and programming, or PBPP. Again, these are federal requirements for DOTs, transit agencies, and MPOs to set various areas of targets. I'm going to be talking about transit safety targets, which is an annual process and is done for 1-year targets at a time. I'll be followed by my colleague Janie Nam, who will be covering the highway safety targets, which are set annually but are based on 5-year rolling averages, just to emphasize that point once again. I'll cover the requirement, the 4 performance measures for transit safety, who they apply to, show you the 2021 targets just to refresh the board on what was done a year ago, what data we do have on performance, which unfortunately I believe is not complete, and then profile the 2022 draft regional transit safety targets, which we'll be bringing back to you in December for formal approval. So again, this whole presentation today and Ms. Noms are on the PBPP requirements. These are federal requirements. In this case, for transit agencies and for MPOs, annually set targets for the 4 measures. MPOs have 180 days following to adopt targets for our metropolitan planning area, in other words, regional targets. The 4 transit safety performance measures, in this case, we don't distinguish between numbers and rates. They're just grouped under one category. So fatalities, both the number of fatalities and then the rate, in this case, using a denominator of vehicle revenue miles per hour. How many miles are traveled by a different mode of transportation, whether it be subway, streetcar, urban bus, and so forth. Injuries category, again, reportable injuries and rate of injuries. safety events, and they're listed down there: collisions, derailments, fires, life safety evacuations. And lastly, system reliability using a standard transit industry measure, mean distance between failure. This is sort of the average miles a vehicle will travel before it has to be pulled from service because it can no longer complete its intended trip. And so these are all measures used by the transit industry. So again, the FTA put out a rule, and we have to follow these requirements. So this rule does apply to recipients and subrecipients in our area of 5307 funding. That's an urban funding. There are obviously other funding programs for rural areas and so forth. The agencies that take that FTA money are Metro. It's 3 modes. So again, Metro Rail, Metro Bus, Metro Access, the paratransit system. DDOT, with the circulator bus, the streetcar. MTA, we look at the commuter bus since it operates into our area. PRTC, down in Virginia, operates a bus and paratransit system. And then the local systems in suburban Maryland, Van Gogh Transit, Ride On in the bus, and the paratransit services operated by those counties get federal money through the MDOT, MTA, LOTS, locally operated transit system programs. That's federal money. What you don't see are the Northern Virginia local bus systems. To date, they have not received federal funds. Some of them are reconsidering that, particularly in light of IJA and the other federal acts. But right now, they're not required to perform this requirement. So they are not included in what you're about to see for the safety measures. These were the transit safety measures adopted almost exactly 1 year ago. And again, it's done by modes. So you see heavy rail, which is Metro Rail, streetcar, which is DC streetcar, and then all the bus providers, again, suburban Maryland, Metro Bus, DC Bus, PRTC are grouped together in that urban bus category, commuter buses, demand response, which is most of the paratransit vehicles, and even van pools. And even, in fact, the TPB reports some of this data that goes into these calculations. We take all, when you have multiple operators, we take all that information and merge it together to come up with a regional average. And then the 4 measures across the top: fatalities, serious injuries, safety events, and reliability. And so you can see numbers for both the rate and a number. I will point out that fatalities, every transit agency sets a target of 0. Don't anticipate any fatalities, and so your number of fatalities, rate of fatalities is 0. Again, all the way on the right, that mean distance between failures, how many miles on average a vehicle would travel before being pulled from service because it can no longer complete its trip. So those were the targets last year, and you'll be able to look at the new targets and compare them. Now, we are able to get some information because agencies are required to submit this data to the FTA's National Transit Database. And if you can Google that FTA National Transit Database, safety and security, and look at all the reporting that's done by agencies across the country. Professionally, I will say that I don't think this data is complete. This requirement only came into effect in 2020, and I think we all know that a lot of other events were happening in 2020. 2021, a lot of agencies actually could use a waiver and not report till 2021. I think there's still a lot of data being, not fully reported. People are still getting up to board and getting up to speed. So, for instance, if you look at commuter bus and van pools, no injuries reported in 2021, and somehow professionally, I don't think that's the case. We will see, though, that there are fatalities and serious injuries reported. 8 fatalities happened in or around transit last year. So, in fact, for half of those fatalities, 4 out of the 6 of the urban bus, they were fatalities in another vehicle that, in fact, struck a bus. So there is a little bit of double counting here with the highway or roadway safety targets that you will see in the next presentation. So we typically do have a small handful of fatalities every year on transit, but many years we have 0 by mode. It does happen. We do track that data. And then you can see what else is happening on serious injuries and so forth. These are the proposed 2022 regional transit safety targets. So again, we reached out to each transit provider in the region, asked them to provide their targets. Some of them have already had these adopted, which are usually signed off by the chief executive or general manager of the transit agency. Some of them are still formalizing them. In fact, the deadline basically is the end of this month, but they've already provided us with their draft numbers. In some cases, they're taking this to their board or commission for approval. But we're able to put this information together. Again, these are drafts, so we have towards the end of the month to get any final updates. that are made to these numbers before we bring them back for approval in December. But if you have any comments on any of these, I'll be happy to take those into consideration or respond to them as best I can. Again, this information was collected from all the transit agencies in the region, briefed to our Regional Public Transportation Subcommittee in October. Tech Committee was briefed about this on November 4th. I'm here today to brief you again on the requirements and the draft targets. In December, we'll bring a resolution with the final targets recommending for adoption. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions. Down to Ernie, and otherwise turn it over to Ms. Nam.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. The federal government requires metropolitan planning organizations to review roadway safety performance and to set roadway safety targets each year for their region. So I'll be spending a few minutes today providing an overview of the federal requirement for target setting, followed by a review of our region's progress towards the 2017 to 2021 safety targets, and finally staff recommendations to the next set of regional safety targets. Thank you. To provide some background, the requirement to set safety targets was established by an FHWA final rule issued in 2016. And this rule requires state DOTs and MPOs to adopt annual safety targets in 5 performance categories and to measure and report on progress towards those targets on a yearly basis. State DOTs have until August 31st to report their targets, and MPOs are to report their targets within the following 180 days. The requirement is intended to help states carry out the provisions of the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, which requires states to apply a data-driven and strategic approach to improving safety on public roads. And note that while the final rule refers to the targets as highway safety targets, they apply to all public roads regardless of ownership or functional class. The 5 performance measures that state DOTs and MPOs must set safety targets for are the number of fatalities, the rate of fatalities per 100 billion VMT, the number of serious injuries, the rate of serious injuries per 100 million VMT, and the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. And note that these must all be reported as 5-year rolling averages. States and MPOs develop their own methodology for setting targets, and for the National Capital Region, staff uses an approach that combines the methodology of each state. In a nutshell, the methodology we use applies each state's methodology to their respective portions in our region and then combines them into a regional composite target. For those measures where this methodology resulted in higher targets than the previous year, we cap them so that we don't recommend a higher target this year than was adopted last year. As part of staff's preparation of this year's safety targets, we gathered and reviewed crash and vehicle miles traveled data for 2021. In the next few slides, I'll review the region's progress towards the 2017 to 2021 safety targets. This table shows our regional safety outcomes by year for the years 2017 to 2021, with the last column showing the percentage change for each measure since last year. As you can see, our region experienced increases in all measures since 2020. And one interesting data point is that the region experienced an increase in serious injuries, which translated into an increase in the serious injury rate. And this counters a downward decline that has been occurring over many years. While the rise in the number of roadway fatalities in 2021 increased by roughly 12%, this translates into a relatively small change in the fatality rate, or 1.1%, due to an 11% increase in regional VMT in 2021. Compared to the 2017 to 2021 regional safety targets set by the TPB in December 2020, our region met 2 of the 5 performance measures. And note again that performance is measured as a 5-year average. Our region fell short of its targets for fatalities, the fatality rate, and non-motorist fatalities and serious injuries. However, the region was able to meet its performance targets related to serious injuries and the serious injury rate, even though the number of serious injuries and serious injury rate increased for our region in 2020. And this is because these measures are reported as a 5-year rolling average, and the increase in these categories in 2021 was not enough to offset the progress that had been made between 2017 and 2020. The purpose of this chart is to provide some context for our regional performance, especially regarding traffic fatalities. The elevated fatalities in our region mirrors a trend seen across the U.S. And although this is not intended to minimize the safety trend in our region, it shows that our regional safety trends are not isolated. Also, we continue to remain well below the national fatality rate, which is partially attributed to our urbanized area, but also to continued safety efforts. In all, the data shows that we continue to wrestle with the challenges brought by the pandemic. Fatalities increased in 2020 and remain high, and this pattern is also seen nationwide, so it is not a unique challenge to our region. And while serious injuries increased in 2021, it remains to be seen whether it is a start of a new trend. It is common for there to be fluctuations in safety performance from year to year, which is why performance is evaluated as an average of multiple years rather than on an annual basis. Even with the challenges associated with the pandemic, our regional fatality rate remains below that of the nation, and that underscores the importance of our regional safety efforts. Based on the regional safety performance data of 2021, staff calculated the following targets. This table shows that what our targets would be if we didn't apply that last step in our methodology, which is the cap on the results. This table shows the targets after the cap is applied, and these are the targets that staff are recommending for your consideration. That is, we propose to keep the fatality target at the same level as the target adopted last year, while reducing the targets related to serious injuries, the serious injury rate, and non-motorist fatalities and serious injuries. And this table puts the proposed targets into context with the targets that you have previously set. Following today's presentation, staff will be finalizing the proposed targets based on any board feedback, and then I will be back at the December meeting to request your formal approval of the targets. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you all for a great presentation. We'll start with any questions there in the room.
Ms. Sabisky, Ms. Kostick has a question.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Kostick.
Thank you. More of a comment than a question. Obviously, we had the presentation earlier, and we're seeing the targets here not going in the way that we would like them to be going. I think we as a board have done a lot on this, and I see the DOT's doing a lot on this, and so it is a little frustrating to feel like, what more can we be doing? So I guess that's sort of a general comment, not something I think there's a clear answer to. And then my other comment is just that I appreciate seeing both this juxtaposed at the same time with the transit targets, because I do think it actually shows the relative safety of using transit and mass transit over personal driving. And that's something I think maybe isn't emphasized enough in our discussions and our weighing of the pros and cons of modes of transit. So I appreciate that as we're looking at this, and hope we can continue to align that just so that we're seeing that in the future.
Thank you, Casey. Before I go to the people online, is there anyone else in the room?
Not at this time, Ms. Sabisky.
No, okay. So let's go to Dave Snyder.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I was able to attend part of the earlier session. First of all, a big thank you to Madam Chair for your leadership, to all the members of this board, and to staff for continuing to keep the pressure on. Obviously, this data is depressing and frustrating. So I'm wondering if there isn't a better way to like get people's attention about what we're forced to report here. So I guess my question would be, how are we going to get this out to the general public and to elected officials and other officials who aren't part of TPB to get it more clear that we have a problem here that's getting worse and that we need to collectively act to deal with it? And I think the tools that this board provides we need to collectively more effectively get these tools out and get them used. So again, thanks. Really a question about how can we get this data out to the public. And finally, when we're reporting any of this data to the federal government and elsewhere, we should definitely attach the efforts that we're making here through the TPB and regionally. Thanks much for the opportunity to make these comments, Madam Chair. And again, thank you for your continued leadership on this.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think all of us as representatives from our jurisdictions on this board, I hope everyone, as we've talked about throughout this year, are going back and sharing information with our other members of our governing bodies. And by doing that, you're also sharing some of it with the public. I agree with your remarks and Casey's remarks that, it's very frustrating to know how much is being done and not seeing the needle move more than what we would like. But I don't know if there is an answer from staff on this, because I do think a lot's being done.
Madam Chair,
Thank you, Ms.
Dave Steiner, just to follow up, one particular way we could do this is put this in a letter to our various legislative groups.
That's a good idea.
As a way to get it out to more to the state level, that particularly in Virginia has a lot of control over what we do. Thanks a lot. Sorry for the interrupting.
No, that's a great idea. It's a great idea. Conti, you want to go forward?
No, thank you. I appreciate Mr. Snyder's comments and suggestions. One of the ways we could do is next month when the TPB adopts these highway and transit safety targets. And it's not something, from day one, the TPB has not been happy or comfortable adopting these targets because they are at such large deviation from its own aspirations, which is either Vision Zero or towards zero death. One of the things the board could consider is a communications cover page or cover document that can go along with the targets that we are adopting, because that's the federal requirement, but also making 2 points. Recognizing the efforts that the TPB member jurisdictions at the local and state level are doing, but also calling attention to the large gap that continues to exist between our aspirations and what we are seeing here, which could be issued as a call for additional action. And I think Mr. Snyder's suggestion of that communication package being sent to the legislators at the state level or perhaps at the federal level, those are all things that definitely could be done. And we can work with our own public outreach specialist on staff to come up with how can this information then be made available to the public, because every one of us has a role to play here in terms of trying to reverse this trend. So we'll definitely look into that and bring some thoughts to you in December.
Great. I see no other questions online. Is there anything from anyone in the room, Lynn? Nope. Okay. So we're going to move along. Last month, we received a staff proposed process and schedule for updating our long-range transportation plan in 2024. The board had said that it would like this update to more fully reflect the TPP's goals and priorities, and for the updates to be informed by the results of TPP's scenarios studies. Stacy will brief us on some resource documents staff has developed to help our agencies review and update the projects and the long-range plan. Before that, Conti, if you would like to set up this topic, and then you can turn it over to Stacy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This did come up as part of earlier in the agenda with Ms. Kostick's question, and then followed by Ms. Wheeler's question in terms of this update to the plan. Even though the TPB updates its plan regularly, how is this different? How can this provide or come up with a plan that is better than the current plan that the TPB has? So I provided some details as part of that discussion, but one of the things that I noted then was there are two explicit things that the TPB has outlined in its resolution last year for this update, and that is to make sure that the TPB member agencies, the decision makers, because the critical thing is not a single project in the TPB's plan is decided by the TPB. They are done, those decisions are done at the local governments, state governments, and in some states, in a sub-regional body. Second, many of those projects, by the time they come to the point of having funding on them, it would have been 10 years or longer. I heard that there was a good anecdote shared by U.S. Senator Warner at the Silver Line opening yesterday in a humorous way, noting how old U.S. Transportation Secretary was when the plans for Silver Line started. 3 years old, right? Third grade, right? So this is just a means of saying that projects don't appear at the TPB overnight. Second, projects that the TPB accepts have a very specific and, in my view, a high hurdle to cross, and that is the project has to demonstrate that it has the funding to be built, operated, and maintained for the next 20 years plus. So that demonstration of funding is not somebody saying, oh, I believe we will be able to get the money, but showing it in the local and state capital programs, which, once again, is done as a decision by a body, not by an individual jurisdiction. A TPB member locality might aspire for a project, they may design the project, they may propose the project, and they might say this is how it advances TPB goals. But the decision to fund that project happens in a larger body. For example, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they have to go through something called a smart scale system. The Commonwealth Transportation Board evaluates that project. Some of the projects are funded through the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority that has its own project evaluation and project rating and project prioritization process. I mention all of these things by means of saying that the projects that eventually come to the TPB have gone through a lot of local planning process. So the TPB's resolution last year was, we acknowledge that, we recognize that, but it is important that when those decisions and discussions about project prioritization are happening, to make sure that those decision makers are fully aware of the regional policy priorities that the TPB has developed through a consensus process. I tend to believe that the TPB's goals and priorities are not at odds with the goals and priorities of the local jurisdictions or of the state bodies or of the sub-regional entities. They are generally consistent. They are oftentimes different only in means of how comprehensive some of them are or how specific some of them are. Right? So the TPB's resolution said, let us make sure that in the next update, every member jurisdiction where decisions are being made has a very clear understanding of what the TPB's goals and priorities are. So that's the first thing. Although the TPB has been developing this, it's been off and on over a long period of time. It has never been compiled into a single document. That is one of the documents Stacy will now review for you. And this is a draft. We are asking you to review it because you are eventually the decision makers. Tell us if this is not clearly communicating or what else it might be missing that you believe is a TPB adopted regional goal and priority. And we will revise this document, bring this back to you in December. That's the first document. The second thing that the TPB said in its resolution last year is there is always a question, what if we did something different? Doesn't matter whether it's a transportation project, land use project, or a vacation. You know, I went to this beach. What would have happened if I'd been to some other beach? So the what if question is very natural. And the TPB has been asking the what if question for a long time with regards to regional transportation projects. The way to answer the what if questions are scenario studies. what if this happened? What if that happened? And when we did those what if studies, we never asked the question, do we have the money to do this? Do we have the political enabling authorities to implement these policies? We didn't ask that, and that was intentional, to find out what is the potential of various projects, programs, and policies to provide a much improved transportation system experience in the region. So the TPB in its resolution said, all of those scenario analysis has taught us what kind of investments we should be making going into the future. Let us make sure that our member agencies are aware of what those scenario analysis have told us. That is the second document Stacy will review with us today. The second document particularly is our effort to summarize 11 different scenario studies we have done. Some of them are, one might say, is unrealistic. But nevertheless, the question was asked, what if this happened? So we have tried to summarize that. They come from more than 800 pages. It's been a challenge for us to try and summarize it into a small document. If we tried to do it in 2 pages, we might as well not have attempted it because it's impossible. We've asked a lot of questions, and those questions, the answers are not as simple. But we have tried to do that. Earlier, a comment was made that, oh, there'll be 25 pages of document provided to provide the update. Well, respectfully, decisions are made from a position of knowledge and information. Knowledge and information, in my opinion, is gained when we put some effort into reading or understanding or experiencing something. If we want more than $40 billion of investment in transportation enhancements, if we want a different mix of more than 485 projects, it takes a little bit of investment of our time to understand what it is that we have learned, what are our shared goals and visions. So I apologize that this is not a 2-page document, the scenario summary, but we have tried to make it easy to understand. We have tried to make it an easy read. Nevertheless, it is still a draft. We are asking for your critical review and feedback. Please let us know how this can be further distilled, what is not clear, what can be added, and we will bring back a revised version to you next month. All of this, these 2 documents and a bunch of other documents, is what we have been pulling together, and all of your member agencies and their staffs will receive this, and that we hope will inform the local decision making. And the last thing I would say, when I was talking about this with one of the senior members in the District Department of Transportation, the person had a very interesting comment. When we explained this is what the TPB is expecting from each of you, the person said, oh, this might be an opportunity to hold a charrette within our agency to decide how we want to make our investments. A charrette that includes technical and elected officials at individual jurisdiction level. That is what we hope that these sets of documents will inform. Because coming finally to the TPB and saying the TPB should either invest in this project or advise somebody not to invest in that project, regrettably, that is not how the TPB operates. We might want it to, but that's not how it does. So anyway, that's just my opening set of comments. But Stacy, please.
Thank you so much, Director Sakant. So we'll kick off this item with the cover slide here. So as Kante mentioned, there are 2 resources that we're providing, and I'll touch on those today. The covers on the left and the right are of the policy framework and the scenario summary. And both of these are posted with today's agenda items. So if you're wondering where those are, agenda item number 8, there are links to each of these documents, and there's a little bit of an introduction to each of them just to contextualize them for you, help keep everything straight as to how we are expecting to use these. So I'm going to pause and review a bit of what we talked about last month to keep everyone on the same page, because our team talks about this every day. We know you have jobs that you talk about an awful lot of other topics, and so let's just refresh. With all of the staff of the TPB,
Our job is to respond to you as board members and be your staff, and as such, we're responding to the resolution from June of 2021 in the most forthright way in which we can do. We are intending to update the plan, which was approved by the federal partners in August. We're intending to update that plan by the end of 2024 per direction of the resolution. That will include non-transportation elements, financial plan revisions, new motor vehicle emissions budgets, which is essential, and this very important activity of re-examining all of the projects in the plan and asking for a resubmission of those that the agencies either already have in the plan or they find fit to resubmit. This will give us a nice clean database to work with, but more importantly, be as reflective as possible of the TPB priorities. So this is a slide that just expands on what I just mentioned. These four major additional activities or changes to the that will be reflected in this update. I'm going to highlight the rest of this conversation on number 4 that you see at the bottom, which is discussing the reexamination and resubmission of projects, programs, and policies for this plan. We're focusing on the constrained element for the projects, understanding that there are so many other projects, programs, and policies that are happening that are reflected in more the policy element of the plan, but specifically when we're talking about resubmission, it's for that constrained element. So we want to see that it's reflective of TPB's enhanced policy priorities. So I'll review the synthesized policy framework. We want it to be reflective of the TPB scenario studies, as you've directed. And so we've summarized that into basically 2 documents, and I'll talk about those so you can kind of get a sense of where to look. And then, of course, your agencies, working with you, we have intentions to have our kickoff, our call for projects, the technical input solicitation, whatever you might choose to call it, early 2023, enabling about 3 or 4 months for elected officials, other leadership to have conversations, those charrette-type conversations that Director Sukanth was just mentioning, so that we can ensure that there's ample time for those robust conversations to make sure the projects that are moving forward are as reflective of the policy framework and the scenario findings as possible. So this is not our typical call for projects where within 45 days we have all of the technical inputs and you see them after the comment period, with the comment period 2 months later. We've got about a 6-7 month process for that whole, for those steps to undertake for this plan. So just to reiterate, major activity number 4, scrubbing the plan. This will be based on how each local jurisdiction discusses their inputs, which of those they find that are exempt or non-exempt that they want to move forward, what they plan to resubmit, what projects they might be able to change in ways to be more reflective of the policy framework or scenario findings. But ultimately, we're working with all of the jurisdiction staff at this time in order to take all of the data that we have, it's extensive, and say, this is what the TPB has in order to understand what's exempt and non-exempt. We're working with the jurisdictions so that they can also identify any additional funding that TPB does not have, as we do not have all of that information, only that which is federally reflective. And I think what's important is this will be taking extra time of technical staff, elected officials, and other leadership to have those important conversations. And we understand that those conversations have always taken place on some level, but we're really working that into our process to enable that time for zero-based budgeting approach discussions. Exempt projects, as Director Sukanth noted, are those that are under construction or currently funded with federal, state, regional, local, or private funds. Those are the words from the resolution. And we're looking to honor that in the work that we do so that we can support your decision making at the regional level. So this last bullet, I just want to go back to this. Staff will be scheduling to facilitate virtual meetings with the elected officials, the board members in Virginia, Maryland, and DC will have 3 separate meetings to have at the sub-regional level conversations about those projects, programs, and policies being resubmitted with real focus on projects at this point for this plan update. So certainly we strongly encourage those charrettes back at the local jurisdiction, but we'll also be hosting those so that the board members that serve on this board are not seeing or hearing about projects that are being resubmitted for the first time when we release the information for comment period. All right, let's get on to the information that's new here that we're sharing with the Chapter 3 of Visualize 2045, and I do have some hard copies if you'd like to pick up at the end of the table. Chapter 3 of that plan takes numerous pages to start to lay out a summary of each of these documents: the vision, region forward, the regional priorities plan, the aspirational initiatives. There's a comprehensive set of policy priorities, goals that our region has, but there are a lot to get through. So that is a very long chapter for discussing goals. When we have conversations about policy priorities, when you want to have conversations about policy priorities, you don't want to bring out a 5-pound document to talk about, right? So we have taken a lot of our time to go through every one of those documents to examine all of the words that are used, the ideas that are presented, the intention behind each of the goals and word choice, and synthesized that into something much shorter, much more brief, that we believe we've done our best effort to reflect the intention of each of those policy frameworks. So it should reflect the vision, it should reflect the ideas of Region Forward, the goals and challenges documented in the Regional Priorities Plan, as well as the aspirational initiatives. So I welcome you to take a good look at it. See if you think we're missing something. This document also fully reflects the board's climate change goals, resilience goals, along with that importance of safety that we've been discussing, because every single life matters. So this is a visual we've created that shows 5 principles around the edges of a series of cogs that reflect our goals, ultimately with the idea that all of these must work together to result in the livable and prosperous communities that we look for in our region. So what I've done with our slide presentation here is just worked in the policy framework document. I'm going to quickly go through it and then go back. So this is a very brief document, provides a little bit of background on why this policy framework informs planning for our region, highlights the basic essentials of the policy framework, including principles, goals, strategies, and the use of performance measures. We have an outline of principles and goals, We have an outline of principles and 2 pages of goals for a total of 8 goals. And then it gets into a discussion of your endorsed TPB strategies, those strategies that have come from all of our scenario findings, that if we said, if you had to come up with the ultimate results of all of the TPB scenario analysis, it's really this page. It's the strategies you've endorsed that have been demonstrated to be the most effective. And then the last page talks to the importance of measuring performance, which we do with every plan, and which we do also with performance-based planning that my associate Eric Randall was speaking to earlier today. Going back, let's dig in a little. The policy framework, based on all of the work that's been done by board members over the last 20+ years, now includes TPB principles. These include equity, accessibility, prosperity, and livability, right, with the idea that every single project that moves forward should uphold these principles. These are very similar to the Region Forward principles, and we've added equity because we know that equity must be considered in all we do in order to work toward the world that we all want. And so when we talk about the TPB principles, we're looking for every single project to be able to uphold these. Going on to the TPB goals, We've broken it down into 8. We understand we could have 20, 30, 40 goals based on all of the various things we'd like to accomplish. But from a communication strategy, for you to be able to talk with your staff, your local citizens, needs to be something manageable, right? So we have boiled it down to 8. Let us know if we got that number right. One of those first goals is safety. Each of these goals has a little description. Kim, would you mind zooming in on the safety goal for us? Oh, maybe that's harder to do than I thought. It's one page up. There it is. Just wanted to make that a little easier for everyone to see. So the way we've treated every goal that we've produced is based on all of those documents, provided a brief description of the goal, and then some ideas as far as what it takes to achieve that goal. These aren't necessarily strategies like the TPB endorsed strategies, but the kind of backup that explains what is necessary to accomplish and make possible reducing fatalities and injuries, for example, in this case. So you'll see there's a little description. In this case, it's the safety of all users, including travelers, maintenance, and operation personnel. Each of those should be ensured, safety for each of these should be ensured on all parts of the transportation system at all times. And to provide a transportation system that is safe, we must maintain it. We must be able to communicate across various media platforms, need to conduct ongoing transportation operation training and education. And you can see there's bullets along this line that provide some insights as to the types of actions necessary. So this is just one. I won't read through them all, I promise, but I would definitely ask that you provide us feedback over the next couple of weeks as to whether or not you think we're missing anything, if we got anything wrong. Other goals, maintenance. Every single scenario study we've done focuses on maintenance and a state of good repair is the foundation of the scenario study, because if we don't do that, if we don't maintain and operate our system, which y'all probably remember because I've said it a lot, requires 80% of our funding, then we can't accomplish much else. So another goal is reliability. Reliability is incredibly important to our economy, to the people trying to just live out their lives, to issues of equity, and so we've defined that as a goal in its own. Efficiently operating the transportation system, making sure that we're applying technologies, conducting integrated management, using all of the best practices and best technologies to make our system work. If you wouldn't mind zooming back out, Kim. Great, next. And I'll just go to the next page once you get to full screen. Thank you very much. So the other 4 remaining goals that are on this second goals page, including having a system that is affordable and convenient. Again, another incredibly important goal when we look at it from an equity perspective. Environmental protection. Within this environmental protection goal, we reflect your climate goals, reducing the greenhouse gases 50% by 2030, 80% by 2050. But we also understand that there is a lot more to environment than greenhouse gas reduction, so it does capture other important aspects of environmental protection. We also have a separate goal for a resilient region. We need to plan to be resilient in the face of climate change, in the face of economic changes, and whatever other types of uncertainties come at us. We want to have a system that serves its people and its businesses. And so we've identified that as an important goal going forward. And TPB plans on working in the resiliency planning ever more so going forward. We understand that that's been a priority for this year. And lastly, all that we've spoken of, the principles, all of these goals, they're ultimately to achieve those livable and prosperous communities, which is the last goal reflected on this page, but certainly everything else is a foundation to having those livable and prosperous communities. So when we go to the next page here, come on, clicker, we identify the importance of how to achieve TPB goals, which is to implement TPB priority strategies. And it asks for this update that the projects moving forward in some way reflect at least one of each of these strategies. Some projects are just maintenance, and that's the core of what we do. Other projects are doing the hard work to implement a BRT system in an existing built-out area, also very challenging, but I encourage you to look through this list. You should find it reflective of both your aspirational initiatives and your endorsed GHG strategies, GHG mitigation strategies. The last page, we do you the favor of not listing our 200 plus performance measures here, but we acknowledge the importance of measuring performance. Appreciate the laughter, thank you. We do use performance measures in a lot of ways. We've tried at times to align them to each of the goals, but ultimately, so many performance measures correspond to many different aspects of our goals. So what we talk about is the importance of it, TPB's commitment to continuing to report performance to you, and what we really try to achieve, which is better, livable communities where people can live out their lives successfully. All right, I know I'm up here for a long time and I have a lot to share with you, but I will start getting on to the next document here. So we have two versions of our scenario findings document. Ultimately, we have 9 major scenario studies that were done and then some sensitivity analyses that were done. So we can just look at that as a total of 11 scenario findings, and I'll talk a little bit about those to you. Looks like this, pretty thin. We have a 10-page document, and we have a 50-page document. The 10-page document is designed to not only communicate the findings from each of those scenario studies that we've done over the years and the 800 pages, but to really focus on what-if questions. You know, as members of our board, we know that you have to respond to your own stakeholders, and people wonder, what would happen if we never built another highway project? What would happen if we only invested in transit projects? What if, right? And that's the foundation of scenario studies, asking what if. And so we have summarized everything that we've learned into a short series of what if questions to help kind of get at the core of what you might be wondering. And we understand that decision makers want to make the most cost-effective and most effective decisions they can when it comes to making investments. Our job as TPB is to not make those decisions for you. It's to provide you with good information that you can make decisions. So the analysis, the studies, everything that we do is to help you determine what are good choices that you can make when it comes to strategy investment, who benefits from those investments, and what can you actually expect if you implement a BRT system, if the region expands metro, what kind of results can you actually expect from your investments? And the reality is no single project is going to show up in a significant way in our regional analysis. It takes all of these projects working together to start to make progress on our measures. Most of these individual projects make significant differences to the lives of individuals that are benefiting from them. But nevertheless, when we look at scenario analysis, we look at larger packages of projects in order to be able to actually get to those answers of what if that you want to know the answer to. So just a couple quick examples that I'm sure you'll be curious about, for which I need my glasses. But what if we implement our plan, the one that you approved in June? Well, we're still expecting to see vehicle hours of delay go up by about 48%. We're still expecting VMT to go up by about 15%, and greenhouse gases to go down by 11%. What if we did nothing? What if we only maintained and operated the system? Are you curious? VHD goes up 80%. So implementing the plan shows benefits. VMT goes up 14%. Doesn't change a lot. And GHG would go down about 13%. So what if we only invested in transit and we didn't build a single one of the highway projects? We'd see those vehicle hours of delay go up 76%, but VMT would only go up 13%, largely because there'd be so much congestion. And GHG, again, would go down 14%, again, hovering right around 13, 14 in all of these scenarios. So what if we ran, this was an internal analysis we did as some testing for some of our other scenarios that we shared during the scenario discussions. What if we ran our bus and other transit at headways every minute, right? You would never miss the bus, basically. And we had all of the BRT run times cut by 50%, so moving twice as quickly, basically. Vehicle hours of delay would go up by 52%, VMT would go up by 17%, and GHG would go down by about 24%. And if we only built highway projects and no transit, we'd see vehicle hours of delay go up 51%, VMT up 16%, and GHG down 11%. What you're not hearing is panaceas, right? So I encourage you to take a look at the scenario document because it shows what everything that the TPB does and its members do matters, but not a single one of these projects is going to be a panacea. So when you endorse the aspirational initiatives, I think that was a really good example of the idea that it takes everything in order to start making progress on our goals. So one last thing, we are big promoters of telework, travel demand management. We have our own commuter connections program, but there's a limit, right? We tested during COVID what would happen if travel was reduced by 50 or 80%. And we have results on that in the study as well. But we also saw the impact to the economy, to quality of life. So everything has trade-offs. That is not my decision. But I encourage you to take a look at the scenario documents. They are in draft. Tell us if we missed something. Tell us if there's something else that you think we haven't covered. But we've covered a lot in these last 11 studies. And so I'm going to just jump into what's in that 50-page document. So we have this 10-page summary, and then in the 50-page summary, organized into the following sections, you can actually get into any one of these particular topics and get summaries of the findings from all of our studies. We worked really hard on this to make this meaningful and readable and provide useful insights. So you can find roadway findings, pricing policy findings, VM tax, land use implications, vehicle technologies, and more. So ultimately, how should this be used? As Director Comp said, take a look at those projects that are being resubmitted. See, are they as reflective as they could be of the scenario findings, of the policy priorities? Take a look at the documents and tell us if we missed something. But ultimately, we really do hope that members of our board can think regionally and act locally to make the decisions, because it will ultimately be up to each member and the conversations they have in their local jurisdiction or agency as to what gets resubmitted to the plan. And so with that, I'll close out that we would love to have any of your feedback by December 2nd so we can make any modifications to documents. And I thank you for your time. And Chair, if there's time, I'd be happy to take questions.
Great information, and really helpful information. I believe we have a few minutes, not too much, because we do need to be able to move on to WMATA. So if there's any burning question that you can't put in the chat, we can ask that, but I guess it's got to be very quick or we're going to take time away from the WMATA stuff. I don't see anything online. Is there anything there in the room?
And I think we brought this up. I think at the technical committee on or at the beginning of the month. But to what extent can you integrate and either run a scenario, but take a closer look at the connection of land use in the region? What if on more jobs on the eastern part of the region, closer to where there is housing, looking at the 15 underutilized metro stations, things of that nature? And then sort of a side question, how are you integrating the sort of the goals and objectives that were passed as part of the climate change resolution into this exercise?
Sure. So the results of the climate study are included in this summary that is considered one of our scenario studies. I would encourage you to take a look at the land use section of the larger report, which we're referring to as Appendix A. There's a whole section on land use where it discusses the couple of scenario studies that did look at what we call the east-west divide and reallocated housing and jobs from one part of the region to the more eastern portion. We also studied reallocation of jobs and housing to around high-capacity transit, metro stations, and things like that. And there's a lot of findings on that. And then also we can point to the studies in which those are actually examined where there's more extensive details, but in the name of trying to summarize, we do provide some of the key takeaways. Thank you.
Chair Sabesky?
Yeah.
If I may.
I was going to say, there's two people in the chat. I mean, in the online that have questions. Are you able to put those in the chat, guys? Because we're already 5 minutes behind, or a couple minutes behind for WMATA. If not, then it's just taking time from WMATA.
Okay. Mr. Sabesky, I would suggest members to provide their comments and questions to us. We will compile all of them, respond to all of them, and email it to all of the board members. We have the panel from WMATA here, and this is an excellent opportunity. I don't remember in the past 35 years or so that the region is taking such a focused initiative to re-examine and redesign their bus network, and importantly, where the TPB is being asked to provide its priorities for what would be a better bus for the region. So we have a limited amount of time. We have our guests from WMATA. So with that...
Thank you. They took down their hands. Thank you, guys. Please put your questions in the chat. This board discussed building back ridership on our transit system after the COVID pandemic disrupted travel. We are here at the TPB to recognize how critical bus service is to the region from our own work. Oh, I forgot to say thank you, Stacy. From our own work of monitoring the impact on our transportation system during the pandemic. We learned how the pandemic highlighted the importance of bus service. Bus ridership did not decline as much as that is on the rail. The pandemic also highlighted the gaps in our bus service, specifically for those who are transit dependent and those who could potentially be using the bus system. With this knowledge and the fact that we expect the travel pattern in the post-pandemic period to be different from before the pandemic, it is the perfect time for all of our bus systems to re-examine their bus network. The TPB is glad that WMATA, that carries the lion's share of our region's transit ridership, has initiated such a network redesign. I'm glad to welcome WMATA's team that is working on this important initiative. Tom Webster, Leroy Jones, Peter Cafaro, and Allison Davis. While they will briefly describe the project, they are here to listen to what we believe or expect from a better bus system. So get your thoughts ready while the WMATA team briefs us. With that, I will turn this over to perhaps you, Tom Webster.
Yes, thank you, Chair Sabesky and members of the board. My name is Tom Webster with Strategy, Planning, and Program Management at Metro. We're very happy to be here today to discuss Metro's Better Bus Initiative and to hear feedback you might have as to what better buses mean to you, your agency, constituents, communities, and to the region. For too long, buses have been good but not great, a good but not great transportation option in our region. Bus service and associated infrastructure have been under-resourced, resulting in service that for many customers is infrequent, not reliable, and not what it could be. As the region moves forward, Metro is doubling down on the recommendations from the recent bus transformation strategy to improve bus. Metro's leadership and board are committed to transforming the region's bus service into fast, frequent, reliable, and affordable service that meets our customers' needs, feels to them like a unified system, and isn't unnecessarily tied to geographic or funding boundaries. Change is not easy, and this is going to take some stamina, strength, and clearly some partnership. I'd like to invite my colleague, Leroy Jones, who is our Senior Vice President of Bus Service, to share his perspective.
So thanks, Tom. And thank you, TPB board members. We really appreciate the opportunity to come speak to you today and hear your feedback. And also thanks to allowing the Metro team to come today. Metro Bus Operations team is approximately about 4,000 members. When you look at maintenance mechanics as well as bus operators and training instructors and a lot of other administrative folks that kind of make the system go every day. We're committed to providing safe, customer-focused bus service and finding ways to continuously improve service and the experience for our bus customers throughout the region. Metro obviously isn't the only bus provider in our region. So I, along with my team, are partnering with the other local bus providers through the National Capital Region Bus Leaders Committee. We just had a meeting the other day, and the group continues to identify solutions to challenges that we all face as an industry, including recruitment, procurement challenges, bus stops and shelters, and making the regional network we love more unified and understandable for our customers. We're excited to work with our planning colleagues throughout the region to redesign the bus network, incorporating bus operators and union leadership's input throughout the process, and also to meet the needs of our customers throughout the region. We have authentically engaged and will continue to do so with various stakeholders throughout the process. I'd like to invite my colleagues, Allison Davis and Peter Capiero, to present the Better Bus Initiative and specifically talk about the bus network redesign. I want to say publicly, I think the team has been doing an amazing job, so kudos. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Leroy. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Chair Sebeski and members of the board. So my colleague Peter and I are going to talk to you just briefly about the Better Bus Project, spend a bit more time talking about the network redesign. But ultimately, we do want to hear from you, and we've been out talking to many of you and your staff and colleagues. So happy to take comments in, put them in the chat, or reach out to us after the meeting. So, you know, I was listening to the Silver Line opening yesterday, and you know, we think about this great thing from a regional perspective. We think of bus from a regional perspective, but ultimately it's about the customers, right? And so I think about, you know, when we talk about who rides the bus, it is very different from the demographics of the region. It's also very different from demographics of the railroad. And so thinking about, you know, the immigrant who has moved here and relocated here and is trying to connect to social services and education. Thinking about the mom, the single mom with two jobs, trying to make those connections. And for, you know, a lot of people in this region, bus is the family car, right? So that is, it's 5 times more likely for our bus customers to not have access to a car at all. 10 times more likely to live in low-income households. So it's really thinking about what those needs are, and as we build out that network and as we build out a better bus system, why it's so important. So we have surveyed, many of you who operate bus systems have also surveyed, and the top 3 things, customers want frequency, they want reliability, and they want connectivity. And like, that is bar none, every demographic across the region, every level of income, that is the top 3 that customers tell us again and again. So I think it's really important to keep highlighting that as what's important. And so, as Tom mentioned, prior to the pandemic, we had wrapped up the bus transformation project, and it came out with a number of strategies. We worked on it with all the regional bus operators, and we were able to accomplish about 8 of those during the pandemic. Those recommendations have closed. We've moved forward on all of the rest, and we have packaged those as part of our Better Bus project. So that is really looking at how do we move forward on zero emissions vehicles, working with many of you on, or your teams on transit signal priority, prioritizing buses, the network redesign, that sort of thing. So it's really trying to look forward at the things that will take a bit longer and need some TLC. So to the think regionally, act locally, this is the Better Bus System, or the Better Bus Initiative is really our work to meet a lot of the goals that actually Stacy just outlined, that are in Visualize 2045, that have been in Region Forward since the late 90s, right? That a lot of those items about reducing BMTs, meeting our climate change goals, getting more people out of cars and walking, biking, and taking transit. So this is like the Better Bus Initiative is our push to help the region meet those goals. So a couple of them, customer information 2.0, it's our way of thinking about how do we really balance the customer experience between customers on the railroad and customers on the bus system. So we recognize that there are differences, wayfinding, getting information about slowdowns, detours, the elusive ghost bus, which many of us have experienced. So a lot of that is to say we recognize that those are issues, and we are starting to, or we're continuing to move forward to get to that. Another part is the bus priority, and I will say that we have partnered with many of the jurisdictions who own and operate the roadways, but really identifying that there isn't one silver bullet for bus priority, but it really takes studying of that corridor and understanding where the challenges are. We are working with Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and State Highway to move forward on some tactical bus lanes in Prince George's and Montgomery County next year. We are also continuing to partner with DDOT and move forward on violation detection system, because obviously the red bus lanes are only as good as if we have cameras and are able to ticket and really move people out of those bus lanes so the buses can move forward. And then finally, before I turn it over to Peter for the network redesign, we're also committed to moving forward on zero-emission buses. So we have, our board, the Metro Board has committed to transitioning to zero-emission vehicles, and we are finishing up our transition plan out all of our vehicles, all of our garages, and really looking forward to what that means. So we'll turn it over to Peter, talk through, and I've got the...
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Tom and Leroy, and thank you, committee and chair. So network redesigns are no longer a new thing. They've been done lots of places nationally, internationally, and even in this region, Alexandria being the most notable that we participated in, that was led by Alexandria. So we need to really take the comprehensive look at the network, to focus on developments that have happened since the streetcars were there or since the bus network was laid out that we currently operate, make sure we're connecting places that need to be connected, to promote equity and make sure that we are addressing the essential workers and regions and neighborhoods that might not have the transportation service that they should have for historical reasons. We want to make sure that the network is easier to understand than it is to people who don't use it. People sort of figure out their own route, but it's hard to understand. We're in a region where Metro runs an 8Y and a Y8 and an 80 bus, and like there's historical reasons, but I don't think our riders really understand or care. They also really don't care so much who's the bus operator. They just want the bus to go where they need to go. So we're taking this approach to some extent agnostic to the operator initially and trying to identify what our customer needs are. The last part is that this has to be coupled with a sustainable but understandable subsidy allocation formula. And right now, we all, I think, agree that the current system really doesn't work for anyone. It's not really understandable. It's not easy to calculate in advance when we're trying to plan stuff. And of course, the bigger picture funding also has to be addressed to make it sustainable. Next. So our board adopted in September some guiding principles that we want to follow, intend to follow during this whole project. The first is to make sure, as I said before, that we're customer focused. What do our customers need? That's the first question we want to answer. How we achieve that? Lots of discussion, but let's not lose sight of what the customers need. We want to engage those customers and really find particularly customers that might not normally participate in a transit planning process, try to connect with them either directly or through organizations that might be able to connect with them. We want to be transparent, inclusive, and just communicate as we go forward. I mentioned the equity, which will be part of this through the entire project and not just at the end as a compliance sort of thing. And to Allison's point before, frequency is probably going to be a key part of this. It's certainly what our customers have told us before, and almost every other network redesign has really emphasized key frequency on key routes while maintaining coverage where we need coverage, because people need to have access to neighborhoods, but not necessarily at the same frequencies. At the end, we have to do this cost effectively and be data driven as well. So this has to be grounded in that as well. Next. I mentioned we're communicating with lots of people. Actually, Leroy mentioned our operators. They're a key part of this because they know the routes better than any of us do and where those problems areas are. So this is not just a where does the bus go, but can the bus get through congestion? Do we need to upgrade the priority or route around the congestion? So we're talking to our operators, we're talking to our labor unions, we're also talking to elected officials, to your organization and others, but going out to meet the customers where they are. We've had numerous bus stop chats at major bus stops and pop-up events at both bus terminals and social service areas and farmers markets and lots of places that people might gather. We have a technical advisory committee that many of you or your staff are part of, and what we call community connections committee, which is really trying to tap into those other organizations that can tap into the community more directly. Next. Before we started this, we went and talked to staff at all of the jurisdictions to see how best to engage each jurisdiction and the jurisdictional operators. Of course, almost every jurisdiction has its own local operator. And as a result of those discussions, Prince George's County and the City of Fairfax elected to go all in with us on the study. So we are doing in this study a network redesign, not only of Metrobus, but also of the bus in Prince George's and Q in the City of Fairfax. Montgomery is currently doing their Ride On Reimagined network redesign, and similar to the Dash City of Alexandria redesign of a few years ago, we will participate in their study, and that study, Ride On Reimagined, will look at all bus service within Montgomery County, and the Metrobus study will look at the bus service coming out of Montgomery and crossing jurisdictional boundaries. And we will stay in very close coordination with them as we move forward on similar timeframes. Goal being not to confuse our mutual customers, and really is to figure out what the best thing to do is for the region. The remaining jurisdictions, we will work also closely with them, but generally treat the existing local operations as fixed, and we will look at the Metrobus and other gaps that might be in there and continue to dialogue. And of course, Alexandria, having already redesigned the network, we don't anticipate any significant changes within Alexandria, but we'll look at connections to the other jurisdictions. We view this as a 5-step process that we've already completed. Step 1, which is the bus transformation study that Allison talked to. That is still our foundation. We don't want to redo the good work that was there, and to stay in close coordination with the other initiatives that came out of that. Currently, we are completing our planning foundations work of looking at data, looking at where there are gaps in service, talking to customers. We just completed a rider survey and had a number of outreach locations over the last 6 weeks or so, and continuing to talk to many different groups and elected officials and other organizations. Over the winter, we're going to boil that down into a couple of proposal concepts that we will take out in the spring, get reaction from all the stakeholders and customers to those concepts. They may emphasize different ways of addressing the problem and the opportunities. We will then take that information over the summer of next year and come up with proposals that we'll take out in September, gain further comment, and our goal is really to feed into our fiscal 25 budget cycle, which starts in terms of the board input a year from now, pretty much November and December of calendar 23, for implementation in the summer or beyond in calendar 24. There will be some changes that exceed the capacity for us to deliver in FY25, either for financial resource or operator numbers or whatever. And so we anticipate that there'll be some that will roll out beyond that. But our goal is for most of this to occur in fiscal 25. And we have a lot of different ways for constituents to get involved. Even though our first round of outreach is nearing completion, we will continue to meet with or talk to anyone who you think we should be talking to and connect people into the process, because the real work and the real input will be as we move forward with new proposals. And we would love to be able to use your organizations to get the word out.
All right. So thank you.
Awesome.
We have 3 minutes, I believe. So we do want to hear from you. And again, if it is either, you can put it in the chat. We have, we have some questions as regional leaders for you. So I can ask the questions or, okay. All right. So, so as a regional leader, what does Better Bus mean to you and for your constituents? I don't know if there's anyone in the room.
Mr. Collins, why don't you answer that?
Ms. Sebeske, this is Kanti. Since we're coming up on time, we have the 3 questions. You can certainly, we will share these questions with each member. And I understand that WMATA will be receiving inputs over the next few weeks. Mm-hmm. So there's, beyond this meeting and the time remaining during this meeting, members could be invited to send their comments and inputs to me, and we will compile it and share it with WMATA. But here are the questions, but you do have a few more minutes if you want to recognize a few people to provide their thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, I hope everyone will take a look at these questions, and if WMATA can put in the chat where you want us to send our answers to these, or we can just put them in the chat, but whichever. I don't know about anyone in the room, but Mr. Collins, our Vice Chair, has had his hand up for a little while online. I'm going to start with Mr. Collins first.
And I'll try to be very brief. And I will be putting this in a letter to WMATA, but around 2018, a very important route that connected the Naval Support Facility in Southern Maryland to the District of Columbia ceased at that time. And it's in many ways consistent with the presentation that you brought here as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the population that was impacted by the ceasing of this designated route is a primarily minority population. And so I will be putting this in the context of an actual letter to WMATA, but I think in terms of future outreach, that you certainly reconsider the impact of ceasing, and I believe it was the W19 route that again connected the Naval Support Facility in Southern Maryland to the district, and many of our federal employees were severely impacted by ceasing that route. And so, but I will be putting that in the context of a letter directly to WMATA and in response to, the requests that you're making.
Is there anyone there in the room that, we're at 2:00, but, just to give the opportunity for anyone in the room to ask a question?
Yeah. Earl Lewis with MDOT real quick. I really commend you for making a special effort to consider transit-dependent populations and also connectivity, similar to Mr. Rubin just said, connected to job centers. that is very important, especially low income that can't afford a vehicle, but also those who've made the choice to be transit dependent. We want to make sure we continue to reinforce that they've made the right choice, and they have their transportation connectivity that they need to live their lives the way they want to. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Yeah, connectivity is very important. I mean, from being in an outer jurisdiction, more people that work inside live out here. So being able to connect these outer bus services in with Metro and making it an easy connectivity is really important. Mr. Snyder, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I agree with the connectivity issue, and I wonder if TPB couldn't have this item on the agenda in a future meeting as well for when we might have a little more time for further discussion. One other point I want to make that I think bus rapid transit and a whole system of bus rapid transit around our region is terribly important, and that particularly the Route 7 corridor, the bus rapid transit there is very important to multiple Northern Virginia jurisdictions. So thanks very much, and look forward to more discussion on this, perhaps at the TPB in addition to our written comments. Thanks again.
Ms. Sebeski,
Yeah, that's
Mr. Aguirre has his hand up here in the room.
Okay.
Thank you. I would echo the sentiments of Mr. Lewis and Mr. Snyder. I'd also add, some of the onus will fall on us as localities. When we talk about safety, bus shelters, lighting, there's some things that WMATA might not necessarily be able to control. But if you could highlight those to then bring to us so that we can make it a priority in our localities, I think that'd be very important. Also, the connectivity with pedestrian infrastructure, because we can't forget what's happened, unfortunately, in several places across the region where people have been hit because the bus is too far from a crosswalk, too far from a light. So just a couple other things to consider as well.
Great comments, great thoughts. And Conti, back to Mr. Snyder. Is there an ability for us to add this into the agenda either for next month or January? If you could look into that and continue this follow up. It is a really important topic, and it is it affects so many areas that we've talked about here: safety and equity and inclusion and equity emphasis areas, all of those things.
Certainly. We've been talking in communications with Tom and Allison for a few months now, and they have really expressed an interest to be closely coordinating with us, and as they're doing with other entities. We'll be happy to bring it back to the board. Maybe it can be on specific focused items so that we make the best use of time to give input.
I think that's great. I can only speak for myself. I'd even be willing to do yet another work session. This is just a really important topic, I think, for the whole region, and something that being able to give that input to is, I think, important to a lot of people here, but because of time, we're not really being able to do that today. So with that, and I'm gonna, I guess, conclude this meeting, and our next meeting will all virtual on December 21st. And like I said earlier, happy Thanksgiving. Stay healthy, enjoy your time with your families. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Amada.
Oh my God. I would never want to scare you. I might want to hit you or something or yell at you. I would never want to.